Imagine standing in what would become downtown St. Louis in the year 1100 AD, looking across the Mississippi River, and seeing something that would make even the greatest cities of medieval Europe pale in comparison. You would witness over 100 massive earthen pyramids rising from the floodplain, some reaching heights of 30 meters, equivalent to a modern 10-story building crowned with wooden temples painted in brilliant reds and whites that caught the morning sun like beacons. You would see a metropolis of more than 50,000 people, making it larger than London at the same time, with streets laid out in precise grids, massive public plazas that could hold the entire population, and a sophistication in urban planning that would not be matched in North America until the arrival of European settlers centuries later. This was Cahokia, the greatest pre-Columbian city north of Mexico, and for reasons that still haunt archaeologists today, it vanished completely, leaving behind only silent mounds and questions that modern technology still cannot fully answer. The story of how this metropolis rose, thrived, and disappeared represents one of the most compelling mysteries in American archaeology, challenging everything we thought we knew about ancient North America. The first European-descended Americans to encounter the mounds had no idea what they were looking at. In 1811, when a merchant traveling through the Mississippi bottomlands stumbled upon these massive earthworks, he assumed they were natural hills. It would take decades before archaeologists even began to accept the truth. These were not geological formations, but human constructions on a scale that seemed impossible for a civilization without writing, without the wheel, without horses or oxen, and without metal tools beyond copper ornaments. The skepticism was so deep that many scholars initially attributed the mounds to a lost race of Europeans or even the mythical lost tribes of Israel, refusing to believe that Native Americans could have built something so sophisticated. This prejudice delayed serious archaeological investigation for over a century and resulted in the destruction of countless irreplaceable sites as farmers plowed through mounds and developers built highways over ancient plazas. Today, we know that approximately 90% of the original city has been destroyed, leaving us with only fragments of what was once a sprawling metropolis that covered nearly 13 square kilometers. What makes Cahokia truly remarkable is not just its size, but the speed of its rise. Carbon dating and archaeological stratification reveal something almost unprecedented in human history. This city exploded from a modest village of perhaps 1,000 people to a thriving metropolis of 50,000 in less than a century. To put this in perspective, this population boom was faster than the urbanization that occurred during Europe's Industrial Revolution. People migrated to Cahokia from hundreds, even thousands of miles away, abandoning the villages of their ancestors to join this burgeoning urban experiment. DNA analysis of skeletal remains shows that Cahokia's population came from at least 15 different cultural groups, stretching from the Great Lakes in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, speaking different languages and bringing different traditions, yet all somehow unified under a common purpose that drew them to this single location on the Mississippi River. What could possibly cause such a massive migration? What promise, what vision, what compulsion could make thousands of families leave everything they knew to gamble their futures on a new city in the Mississippi floodplain? The answer may lie in the sky. On July 4th, 1054 AD, Chinese astronomers recorded the appearance of a guest star so bright it could be seen during daylight for 23 consecutive days. This was a supernova, the explosive death of a massive star, and it would have been visible across the entire northern hemisphere, including North America. For the people who would become the Cahokians, this celestial event may have been interpreted as a direct message from the gods, a sign that the time had come to build something unprecedented. Archaeological evidence shows that Cahokia's explosive growth began almost immediately after this astronomical event, suggesting that religious leaders may have used the supernova to legitimize their vision of a great city, claiming divine mandate for their ambitious urban project. Whether this was cynical manipulation or genuine religious conviction, the result was the same. tens of thousands of people converged on a single location and began building monuments that would rival anything being constructed in Europe or Asia at the same time. The centerpiece of this construction was Monk's Mound, named after French Trappist monks who briefly farmed its terraces in the early 19th century, unaware they were planting vegetables on top of ancient America's greatest architectural achievement. This pyramid is not merely large, it is staggering. The structure contains approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth, all transported in woven baskets, one load at a time, by human laborers working without draft animals or wheeled vehicles. If we assume each person could carry about 20 kilograms of earth per trip, completing Monk's Mound would have required approximately 300,000 person trips, or roughly 1,000 people working every day for 10 years straight. The engineering required to keep this massive earthwork stable is equally impressive. Geological analysis shows that Cahokian builders deliberately selected different soil types for different layers, using clay for water-resistant lower levels, sand for drainage in middle layers, and rich topsoil for the exterior surfaces, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics that many modern engineers would respect. But perhaps even more remarkable than Monk's Mound's size is its precision. The pyramid is not randomly oriented, its corners align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, and its placement within the city creates sight lines to specific astronomical events. During the spring and fall equinoxes, an observer standing at a specific point in the city's central plaza would see the sun rise directly over Monk's Mound's peak, creating a dramatic visual spectacle that would have reinforced the connection between the rulers atop the pyramid and the cosmic forces they claimed to control. This was not accidental. Surveys of the entire Cahokia site reveal a master plan in which individual mounds, plazas, and even residential neighborhoods were positioned according to astronomical and cosmological principles, creating what amounts to a massive three-dimensional calendar built into the landscape itself. The city was not just a place to live, it was a sacred geography, a physical manifestation of the Cahokian worldview, where every structure had cosmic significance, and the entire urban layout reinforced a specific understanding of humanity's place in the universe. This astronomical sophistication becomes even clearer when we examine one of Cahokia's most enigmatic features, the structure archaeologists call Woodhenge. When Warren Whitry began excavating a series of large post holes arranged in a perfect circle in 1961, he initially thought they might be the remains of a defensive stockade, or perhaps flagpoles. He was wrong. What he had discovered was one of the most sophisticated astronomical observatories in the ancient world, a structure that rivaled and in some ways surpassed the famous Stonehenge of England in its precision. Woodhenge consisted of 48 massive wooden posts, each over 6 meters tall, arranged in a circle with a diameter of 100 to 25 meters. But the true genius of the structure became apparent at the equinoxes. Standing at the center of the circle, an observer would see the sun rise through a specific post and align perfectly with the peak of Monk's Mound 400 meters away, with an error margin of less than 1 degree. Modern engineers using GPS and computer modeling have confirmed that achieving this level of precision without metal tools or optical instruments would require generations of careful astronomical observation, mathematical calculation, and engineering skill. The Cahokians built at least 5 versions of Woodhenge over the course of a century, each one more accurate than the last, suggesting they were constantly refining their astronomical knowledge and working towards some specific goal that required increasingly precise timekeeping. Yet beneath all this architectural and astronomical achievement lay something darker. In 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler began excavating a ridge-top mound known simply as Mound 72, expecting to find the burial of an important leader. What he found instead would fundamentally change our understanding of Cahokian society and reveal that this civilization's grandeur came at a terrible human cost. At the center of the mound lay a man in his 40s, his body resting on a platform made from more than 20,000 shell beads, each painstakingly crafted and transported from the Gulf of Mexico, 1,500 kilometers away. But this man did not travel to the afterlife alone. Surrounding him were nearly 300 other human skeletons, buried in distinct groups that suggested different ritual purposes. 53 young women between the ages of 15 and 25 were arranged in 2 neat rows, their bodies showing signs of long-term vitamin D deficiency, consistent with prolonged indoor captivity, before they were sacrificed and buried with the central figure. Another pit contained 39 men with clear evidence of execution. Severed heads, hands bound behind their backs, bodies dumped unceremoniously without grave goods or ritual preparation. A third deposit held 4 men whose heads and hands had been completely removed. The missing body parts never recovered from anywhere in the burial complex. This was not a battlefield burial or a plague pit. This was deliberate human sacrifice on a scale unprecedented in North American archaeology, suggesting that Cahokia's rulers wielded absolute power over life and death and were willing to sacrifice hundreds of people to demonstrate their connection to the divine. The discovery of Mound 72 forced archaeologists to reconsider their assumptions about Cahokian society. This was not an egalitarian community of farmer builders working together toward a common goal. This was a rigidly hierarchical civilization with a powerful ruling elite who could command the labor of thousands and demand the lives of hundreds. The scale of the human sacrifice suggests either profound religious devotion or profound fear, possibly both, and raises disturbing questions about how Cahokia's leaders maintained control over such a large and diverse population. The answer may lie partly in the city's economic power. Cahokia was not just a religious center, it was the hub of a trading network that spanned the entire continent. Excavations have uncovered copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, all flowing through Cahokia's markets and redistributed across the region. The city controlled the confluence of 3 major rivers, the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois, giving its rulers a stranglehold on trade routes that connected the Great Plains, the eastern woodlands, and the Gulf Coast. Anyone who wanted to trade between these regions had to go through Cahokia, and Cahokia's elite could tax, regulate, or even prohibit trade as they saw fit, accumulating wealth and power on a scale that no other North American society could match. But this power came with a price, and as Cahokia's population swelled toward its peak of 50,000 around 1100 AD, the environmental consequences of supporting such a massive urban population began to manifest in ways that would ultimately doom the city. Core samples from lakebeds near Cahokia tell a story of ecological catastrophe unfolding over the course of a century. Before 1000 AD, the region was densely forested with tremendous biodiversity. Pollen analysis identifies over 200 different plant species in the pre-Cahokia landscape. By 1100 AD, 95% of the forests within a 50-kilometer radius had been cut down. The Cahokians needed massive amounts of timber for construction of homes, temples, and defensive walls, for fuel to cook food and fire pottery, for the millions of wooden posts required to build and rebuild structures as they decayed. Without tree roots to hold the soil in place, erosion accelerated dramatically, and each rainstorm carried precious topsoil into the rivers, slowly degrading the agricultural productivity of the land. Biodiversity collapsed from over 200 plant species to fewer than 20 in just a few generations, a rate of ecological destruction that modern scientists compare to 20th century deforestation in the Amazon rainforest. The Cahokians were trapped in a vicious cycle. Their very success required ever more resources, but obtaining those resources degraded the environment that supported them, forcing them to extract even more to maintain the same standard of living, which further degraded the environment, and so on, in a downward spiral that grew worse with each passing year. And then, just as Cahokia's environmental crisis was reaching a critical point, nature delivered a knockout blow. Tree ring data from across North America reveals that around 1150 AD, a severe drought began. part of a broader climate shift sometimes called the Little Ice Age, and it lasted for nearly 50 years. The Mississippi River dropped to levels not seen in generations, making river transport more difficult and reducing the productivity of floodplain agriculture. Game animals migrated to regions with more reliable water sources, making hunting less productive. Fish populations crashed as rivers and lakes shrank, and Cahokia, which had already stripped its hinterland of forests and degraded its agricultural soils, suddenly found itself unable to feed its enormous population. Starvation began to stalk the city. Skeletal analysis from this period shows increasing rates of malnutrition, especially among children, and a spike in violence-related injuries, fractured skulls, broken arms, defensive wounds on forearms, suggesting that social order was beginning to break down as desperate people fought over dwindling resources. And it was in this context of environmental collapse, drought, starvation, and rising violence that the leaders of Cahokia made a fateful decision. They would build walls. The defensive palisade that began to encircle central Cahokia around 1175 AD was not a minor fortification, it was a massive barrier, 6 meters high and 3 meters thick, running for over 3 kilometers in a complete circuit around the city's ceremonial core. Building it required cutting down approximately 15,000 mature trees, further exacerbating the region's deforestation crisis, even as it was supposedly protecting the city from external threats. But here is what makes the walls truly ominous. Archaeological evidence shows they were rebuilt at least 4 times over the next 100 years, each iteration higher, thicker, and more heavily reinforced than the last. This suggests the threat was not only persistent, but escalating, requiring ever stronger defenses as time went on. Yet curiously, there is no evidence of large-scale warfare during this period, no mass graves filled with warriors, no burned buildings, no caches of arrowheads embedded in the palisade walls. So what were the walls defending against? Some archaeologists now believe the palisade may have served a dual purpose. Yes, it defended the ruling elite from external enemies, but it also kept the starving population from fleeing, essentially transforming Cahokia from a city into an open-air prison where the elite at the center could maintain their privileges even as the commoners on the periphery suffered and died. The walls were not just keeping enemies out, they were keeping subjects in, preventing the mass exodus that would have spelled the end of the ruling class's power and privilege. But in the end, the walls failed, and Cahokia died not with a bang, but with a whimper, not through conquest, but through abandonment. Beginning around 1200 AD and accelerating through the next 150 years, Cahokia's population simply melted away. The outer neighborhoods were abandoned first, their inhabitants either dying of starvation or fleeing to smaller, more sustainable communities in the surrounding region. Then the intermediate zones emptied out. By 1300, the population had crashed from 50,000 to perhaps 5,000. By 1350, even the priests had abandoned the temples atop the mounds, leaving behind pottery, tools, and religious objects as they fled to destinations unknown. When French explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 1600s and asked local Native American tribes about the massive earthworks, they received a chilling answer. "We don't know who built them. They were here before us." In less than 2 centuries, the memory of Cahokia had been almost completely erased. A civilization of 50,000 people reduced to silent mounds and unanswered questions that would perplex investigators for centuries to come, forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human civilization itself, that even our greatest achievements can vanish utterly, leaving barely a trace behind. To understand how Cahokia could vanish so completely, we must first understand what they built at the height of their power, because the monuments themselves hold clues to both the civilization's greatness and the seeds of its destruction. At the very heart of the city, dominating the landscape like a man-made mountain, stands the structure we now call Monk's Mound, a name that betrays our ignorance. Borrowed from French Trappist monks who briefly farmed its terraces in the early 1800s, completely unaware they were planting corn and pumpkins atop ancient America's greatest architectural achievement. The mound rises in 4 distinct terraces to a height of 30 meters, roughly equivalent to a modern 10-story building, and covers an area of nearly 6 hectares at its base, larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza. But unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which were built from stone blocks quarried and shaped with copper tools, Monk's Mound was constructed entirely from earth. 22 million cubic feet of soil, carried in woven baskets by thousands of laborers, working without wheels, without draft animals, without any mechanical advantage beyond human muscle, and simple tools made of wood, bone, and stone. The logistics of this construction challenge our understanding of what pre-industrial societies could accomplish. Modern archaeologists have attempted to calculate the labor requirements using experimental archaeology, actually trying to move earth using only the tools and techniques available to the Cahokians. If we assume that each laborer could carry approximately 20 kilograms of earth in a basket, making multiple trips per day, and working perhaps 200 days per year after accounting for weather, agricultural cycles, and religious obligations, then completing Monk's Mound would have required roughly 1,000 workers laboring full-time for a decade, or 500 workers for 20 years, or some equivalent combination of people and time. But this calculation assumes perfect efficiency, no time wasted on planning, no mistakes requiring correction, no portions collapsing and needing reconstruction, which is wildly unrealistic. The actual construction probably involved peak labor forces of several thousand people during critical phases, coordinated by engineers and architects who somehow managed this massive project without written plans, without standardized measurements, and without any of the organizational tools that we consider essential for large-scale construction projects. How they achieved this level of coordination remains one of the great mysteries of Cahokian society. What makes Monk's Mound even more remarkable is not just its size, but its sophistication. This was not simply a pile of dirt heaped up over time, it was a carefully engineered structure designed to remain stable for centuries. Geological analysis of core samples taken from the mound reveals that Cahokian builders selected different types of soil for different purposes. Dense clay with low permeability for the foundation layers, preventing water from seeping upward and destabilizing the structure. Sandy loam in the middle layers, allowing drainage and preventing water from pooling inside the mound. And rich, dark topsoil for the exterior surfaces, which not only created a smooth appearance, but also allowed grass and other vegetation to establish root systems that further stabilized the outer slopes. This demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics, hydrology, and erosion control that many modern engineers would respect. The builders also incorporated wooden posts and matting at critical points within the structure, creating internal reinforcement that helped distribute weight and prevent slumping, a technique remarkably similar to the steel reinforcing bars used in modern concrete construction, adapted to the materials available in pre-Columbian North America. But Monk's Mound's greatest achievement may not be its engineering, but its precision. The structure is not randomly oriented. Its corners align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions, north-south and east-west, with an accuracy that would require careful astronomical observation to achieve. Modern surveying has revealed that the main axis of the mound deviates only about 5 degrees from true north, an error margin that falls well within the normal variation caused by Earth's magnetic field and precession of the poles over the past 1,000 years. In other words, when Cahokia was at its height, Monk's Mound was aligned as precisely as the builders could possibly make it given the limitations of their technology. Why did this matter? Because the mound was not just a platform for temples and elite residences, it was the centerpiece of a vast sacred landscape in which every major structure was positioned according to astronomical and cosmological principles. During the spring and fall equinoxes, an observer standing at a carefully chosen spot in the city's Grand Plaza would see the sun rise directly over the peak of Monk's Mound, creating a spectacular visual effect that linked the earthly rulers atop the pyramid with the cosmic forces they claimed to control. This was political theater on a grand scale, using architecture and astronomy to reinforce the legitimacy of Cahokia's ruling elite. The deliberate astronomical alignments extended far beyond Monk's Mound itself. Archaeologists mapping the entire Cahokia site have discovered that individual mounds, plazas, and even residential neighborhoods were positioned according to a master plan that encoded astronomical knowledge into the very fabric of the city. The central north-south axis of the site aligns with true north, creating a cosmic meridian that divided the city into eastern and western halves. Major mounds were positioned at specific intervals along this axis, their spacing determined not by practical considerations of drainage or defense, but by mathematical ratios related to the solar year and lunar month. The Grand Plaza, a massive open space covering 20 hectares, large enough to hold the entire population of the city during major ceremonies, was laid out as a perfect rectangle, with its long axis pointing east-west toward the sunrise and sunset on the equinoxes. Standing in this plaza during the spring or fall equinox, a citizen of Cahokia would have witnessed the sun rising directly over Monk's Mound to the east and setting directly behind a specific mound to the west, creating the impression that the city itself was a cosmic diagram, a physical manifestation of the Cahokian understanding of the universe. This was not merely impressive architecture, this was sacred geography. A city designed as a temple, every street and building part of a grand cosmological statement. The sophistication of Cahokian astronomy becomes even more apparent when we examine the structure known as Woodhenge, one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in North America. When archaeologist Warren Whitry began excavating a series of large post holes arranged in a perfect circle west of Monk's Mound in 1961, he initially had no idea what he was looking at. The posts themselves had long since rotted away, leaving only dark stains in the soil where wood had decomposed over centuries. But when Whitry plotted the positions of these post holes on a map, a pattern emerged. 48 posts arranged in a circle with a diameter of 125 meters, with one additional post marking the center of the circle. This was clearly not a building in any conventional sense. The posts were too far apart to support a roof, and there was no evidence of walls or a floor. Whitry realized he had discovered an astronomical observatory, a structure designed to track the movements of the sun with remarkable precision. He named it Woodhenge, drawing an explicit comparison to the famous stone circle of Stonehenge in England, but in many ways the Cahokian structure was more sophisticated than its European counterpart. The true genius of Woodhenge reveals itself during the equinoxes and solstices, the key moments in the solar year when ancient astronomers could most easily track the sun's movement across the sky. If you stand at the center post of Woodhenge during the spring equinox at sunrise, you will see the sun appear directly behind one of the posts on the eastern arc of the circle, and if you follow the sight line through that post, it points directly to the peak of Monk's Mound, 400 meters away. The same phenomenon occurs during the fall equinox, creating a dramatic visual alignment that links the astronomical observatory, the rising sun, and the greatest monument in the city, a connection that would have been impossible to miss for anyone watching from the Grand Plaza. During the summer solstice, the sun rises through a different post, marking the longest day of the year, and during the winter solstice, yet another post marks the shortest day. Additional posts mark the cross-quarter days, the midpoints between solstices and equinoxes, creating a solar calendar accurate enough to predict seasonal changes weeks in advance. For an agricultural society like Cahokia, dependent on planting crops at precisely the right time to maximize yields, this kind of astronomical knowledge was not merely ceremonial, it was essential to survival. Modern archaeologists have used computer modeling and GPS technology to verify the precision of Woodhenge's alignments, and the results are stunning. The angular error in the equinox alignments is less than 1 degree, an achievement that would be impressive for modern surveyors using laser theodolites and satellite positioning, let alone ancient astronomers working with nothing more than wooden posts and careful observation of the sky over many years. Achieving this level of accuracy would have required the Cahokians to observe sunrise positions over multiple years, accounting for variations caused by atmospheric refraction, local topography, and the gradual precession of Earth's axis. They would have needed to develop a system of angular measurement, even without formal mathematics or written records, and they would have needed to train generations of astronomer priests to maintain and refine this knowledge over time. And they did all of this not once, but at least 5 times. Archaeological evidence shows that the Cahokians built and rebuilt Woodhenge at least 5 times over a period of about 200 years, each version slightly different from the last, each one incorporating refinements and improvements that made the alignments more accurate. This was not a static monument built once and forgotten. This was an active scientific instrument, constantly being calibrated and upgraded as the Cahokians' astronomical knowledge grew more sophisticated. But why did the Cahokians need such precise astronomical observations? The practical answer involves agriculture. Knowing exactly when to plant corn, beans, and squash could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation, especially in the unpredictable climate of the Mississippi Valley, where late frosts or early droughts could devastate crops. But there was almost certainly a deeper religious significance to Cahokia's astronomical obsession. In many ancient societies, the movements of celestial bodies were interpreted as messages from the gods, and the ability to predict these movements conferred enormous political power on those who possessed such knowledge. If Cahokia's ruling elite could predict eclipses, announce the arrival of important seasonal festivals weeks in advance, and demonstrate that their temples were aligned with cosmic forces, they could claim to be intermediaries between the human and divine worlds, essential links in maintaining the cosmic order. This kind of ideological power may have been just as important as military or economic power in maintaining social control over Cahokia's diverse and potentially fractious population. The monuments were not just buildings, they were arguments, physical proof of the ruler's special relationship with supernatural forces, justification for their authority, and for the tribute and labor they extracted from common citizens. The astronomical sophistication encoded in Cahokia's architecture raises profound questions about the intellectual achievements of pre-Columbian North American societies. For too long, popular and even academic accounts have portrayed Native Americans as primitive peoples living in harmony with nature, lacking the mathematical knowledge and organizational capacity for complex civilization. Cahokia demolishes this stereotype. Here was a society that understood geometry well enough to create perfect circles and right angles across hectares of land without surveying equipment. That grasped the principles of astronomy well enough to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy. That possessed engineering knowledge sufficient to construct stable earthen pyramids 10 stories tall that have survived for 1,000 years, and that commanded the organizational capacity to coordinate the labor of thousands of workers on projects that took decades to complete. And they did all of this without metal tools, without written language, without wheeled vehicles, and without domesticated animals beyond dogs. If Cahokia had survived to encounter European colonizers as a living, thriving city, it would have fundamentally changed Western perceptions of Native American capabilities and might have altered the course of colonial history. Instead, it vanished, leaving only mounds that colonizers dismissed as natural hills or attributed to mythical lost civilizations, allowing prejudices about Native American backwardness to persist for centuries. Yet the very achievements that made Cahokia great also contained the seeds of its destruction. Building Monk's Mound required 22 million cubic feet of earth that had to be excavated from somewhere, creating massive borrow pits that disrupted natural drainage patterns and created breeding grounds for mosquitoes and waterborne diseases. Building Woodhenge 5 times required cutting down hundreds of massive oak trees, contributing to the deforestation that was already stripping the landscape of vegetation. Maintaining the wooden temples atop the mounds required constant repairs and eventual rebuilding as structures decayed in the humid Mississippi Valley climate, creating an insatiable demand for timber that could only be met by ranging farther and farther from the city center in search of suitable trees. And all of this construction served a population that was growing explosively, from a few thousand to 50,000 in less than a century, putting enormous pressure on local resources, food, water, fuel, building materials that were being consumed faster than they could regenerate. The Cahokians were caught in a trap of their own making. Their monumental architecture was both a symbol of their power and a drain on the resources that sustained that power. And the more they built to demonstrate their greatness, the more they undermined the ecological foundations of their civilization. The environmental archaeology of Cahokia tells a grim story of ecological degradation unfolding over generations. Pollen cores extracted from lake beds and wetlands near the city show a dramatic transformation of the landscape over the course of just 200 years. Before 1000 AD, the pollen record indicates a mature hardwood forest with tremendous diversity. Oak, hickory, maple, beech, walnut, and dozens of other tree species, along with hundreds of understory plants, shrubs, and herbs. By 1100 AD, forest pollen drops precipitously, replaced by pollen from grasses and weeds, the signature of cleared land and disturbed soil. By 1200 AD, the pollen of even the weedy species declines, replaced by sediments showing high erosion rates. The land was so degraded that even opportunistic plants struggled to establish themselves. Bone chemistry from animal remains shows a similar pattern of ecological collapse. Before 1000 AD, the isotopic signatures in deer, elk, and turkey bones indicate animals feeding in diverse, healthy forests. After 1100 AD, the signatures shift toward animals feeding in open, disturbed habitats with far less nutritional diversity. The Cahokians were literally eating their way through the ecosystem, consuming resources faster than nature could replace them. And the monuments they built to celebrate their achievements became tombstones marking the death of the environment that supported them. What makes Cahokia's environmental crisis particularly tragic is that it was probably avoidable, or at least manageable, if the ruling elite had been willing to limit their ambitions. Smaller mound-building societies elsewhere in the Mississippi Valley faced similar environmental pressures but survived by keeping their populations in check, diversifying their food sources, and avoiding the kind of massive construction projects that required unsustainable resource extraction. But Cahokia was trapped by its own ideology. The entire political system rested on the claim that the rulers possessed supernatural power, demonstrated through their ability to command the construction of ever larger monuments and the staging of ever more elaborate ceremonies. Scaling back construction would have been interpreted as a sign of weakness, an admission that the ruler's power was waning, potentially triggering challenges from rivals or rebellions from subjects. So they kept building, kept cutting trees, kept expanding agricultural fields into marginal lands, kept pushing the ecosystem harder and harder, even as warning signs accumulated declining crop yields, disappearing game animals, increasing travel times required to find suitable timber. They were locked in a game of ideological one-upmanship where stopping meant losing power, and losing power might mean losing their lives. So they kept going until the system collapsed beneath them. And then, around 1150 AD, just as Cahokia was reaching the limits of its environmental carrying capacity, nature delivered a devastating blow that transformed a manageable crisis into an existential catastrophe. Tree ring records from across North America show that a severe drought began around this time, part of a broader climate shift that would eventually be called the Little Ice Age, and this drought lasted for approximately 50 years with only brief respites. The Mississippi River, normally a reliable source of water and transportation, dropped to levels not seen in living memory. Floodplain agriculture, which depended on annual spring floods to deposit nutrient-rich sediments, began to fail as the floods became less predictable and less productive. Game animals migrated to regions with more reliable water sources. Fish populations crashed as rivers shrank and water temperatures rose. And Cahokia, which had already stripped its hinterlands of forests and degraded its agricultural soils through overuse, suddenly found itself unable to feed its enormous population. The city had gambled everything on a strategy of intensification using technology and organization to extract more resources from the same land, and that strategy worked brilliantly when conditions were favorable. But when conditions turned unfavorable, there was no buffer, no resilience, no way to adapt quickly enough to avoid disaster. The monuments that had seemed to demonstrate Cahokia's mastery over nature revealed themselves to be monuments to human hubris, testaments to a civilization that had grown too large, too fast, and too dependent on unsustainable resource extraction to survive when conditions changed. The combination of environmental degradation and climate change created a perfect storm that Cahokia's ruling elite proved unable to manage. Skeletal remains from burial sites dating to the period 1150–1250 AD show increasing rates of malnutrition, especially among children, the most vulnerable members of society and the first to suffer when food becomes scarce. Bone lesions indicating vitamin deficiencies become common, as do stress markers showing interrupted growth during childhood, evidence that people were going hungry for extended periods. Violence-related injuries spike dramatically during this same period. Fractured skulls from club blows, defensive fractures of forearms where people raised their hands to ward off attacks, projectile points embedded in bones from arrows or spears. The frequency of these injuries increases from less than 5% of skeletons before 1150 to more than 20% of skeletons after 1150, suggesting that social order was breaking down as desperate people fought over dwindling resources. And it was precisely at this moment of maximum vulnerability that Cahokia's rulers made a decision that reveals both their power and their desperation. They began building massive defensive walls around the city center, transforming Cahokia from an open, cosmopolitan metropolis into a fortified enclave, inaugurating the final chapter in the city's tragic history. The decision to build a massive defensive palisade around Cahokia's ceremonial core around 1175 AD was not made lightly, because everyone involved would have understood what it meant. In a city whose power rested partly on its role as an open trading hub, welcoming merchants and pilgrims from across the continent, erecting walls sent an unmistakable message. Cahokia was no longer safe. The old order was collapsing, and the ruling elite were now willing to physically separate themselves from the common population they claimed to protect. The construction project was staggering in scope, requiring approximately 15,000 mature oak and hickory trees to create a stockade wall running for over 3 kilometers in a complete circuit around Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and the elite residential zones clustered near the city center. Each log had to be at least 6 meters tall and 30 centimeters in diameter to provide adequate height and strength, meaning the builders had to locate, fell, transport, strip, and set thousands of massive timbers in carefully excavated trenches deep enough to hold them upright. For a civilization already suffering from severe deforestation, cutting down 15,000 additional trees was not just difficult, it was an act of ecological desperation, sacrificing the future to protect the present. But the elite had no choice. Something was threatening them, something urgent enough to justify this enormous expenditure of labor and resources, even as food was becoming scarce and social tensions were rising. The question that haunts archaeologists is simply this: what were they so afraid of? The conventional interpretation holds that the walls protected Cahokia from external enemies, rival chiefdoms jealous of Cahokia's wealth, or perhaps groups displaced by the same drought that was afflicting Cahokia, looking to seize control of the city's remaining resources. This made sense as a hypothesis for many years, and archaeologists dutifully searched for evidence of warfare. Burned structures, projectile points embedded in the palisade, mass graves of warriors, caches of weapons. What they found instead was puzzling and disturbing in its implications. There is virtually no evidence of large-scale combat at Cahokia during this period. No major conflagration suggesting the city was sacked. No concentrations of skeletal remains with trauma patterns consistent with battlefield injuries. no stockpiles of arrows or spears positioned for defense. The walls existed, massively built and obviously expensive to construct, but there was no corresponding evidence of the external military threat they supposedly defended against. This paradox led some archaeologists to propose an alternative, darker interpretation. Perhaps the walls were not primarily meant to keep enemies out, but to keep the population in, transforming Cahokia from a city into a prison where the starving masses could not flee, and thereby collapse the entire system of elite privilege that depended on their labor and tribute. The walls, in this interpretation, were a tool of social control, a physical manifestation of increasing authoritarianism as the ruling class struggled to maintain power in the face of environmental collapse and popular discontent. But here is what makes Cahokia's palisade truly ominous and transforms it from a curious archaeological feature into a clue about the city's psychological state in its final century. The walls were rebuilt at least 4 separate times between approximately 1175 and 1275 AD, and with each rebuilding, they grew higher, thicker, and more heavily reinforced. This was not normal maintenance, replacing rotted timbers with fresh wood to keep the existing structure intact. These were complete reconstructions, tearing down the old wall and building a new one in a slightly different configuration, always more substantial than its predecessor. The first wall was already massive by any reasonable standard, 6 meters tall, posts set 30 centimeters apart to prevent anyone from squeezing through, with watchtowers at regular intervals. But evidently, this was not enough, because within a generation they tore it down and built a second wall even taller and with posts set closer together. Then a third wall, even more imposing. Then a fourth, the final version reaching heights of nearly 7 meters taller than most modern highway sound barriers, with posts so closely spaced that not even a child could fit between them, creating a solid wooden barrier that must have cast the interior spaces in perpetual shadow. Each rebuilding represented an enormous investment of labor, each time cutting thousands more trees from forests that were already depleted, each time digging hundreds of post holes deep into the clay soil, each time mobilizing work crews to drag massive timbers from ever greater distances as nearby forests disappeared. Why would the Cahokians do this 4 times in a century unless the threat they faced was not only persistent but escalating with each passing decade? The pattern of wall construction correlates eerily with the evidence of environmental degradation and social stress visible in other archaeological data. The first wall goes up around 1175, coinciding with the first widespread evidence of malnutrition in children's skeletons. The second wall is built around 1200, just as pollen cores show the final collapse of forest cover within 50 kilometers of the city. The third wall appears around 1225, corresponding with a spike in violence-related injuries in burial populations. The fourth and final wall dates to approximately 1250, built at precisely the moment when population figures suggest the city was already in terminal decline, having lost perhaps half of its peak inhabitants. It is as though the walls were a barometer of desperation, growing higher and more imposing as the situation grew more dire. Visible evidence of a ruling class that understood they were losing control but could think of nothing better to do than build bigger barriers between themselves and the increasingly hostile world outside. And yet, for all their imposing appearance, the walls failed utterly in their ultimate purpose. They could not stop Cahokia's population from vanishing, they could not preserve the power of the elite who built them, and they could not prevent the city from becoming the abandoned ruin that French explorers would stumble upon centuries later, wondering who had built these earthen pyramids and why they had been left to molder in silence. The construction of the walls had profound effects on Cahokia's social structure and daily life, transforming the character of the city in ways that can still be detected in the archaeological record. Before the walls, Cahokia had been a relatively open settlement where residential areas, craft production zones, markets, and ceremonial spaces blended together in the organic way that most pre-industrial cities developed. Common citizens could walk freely throughout most of the city, attending ceremonies at the Grand Plaza, trading at markets near the mounds, and even approaching quite close to Monk's Mound itself, though presumably they were not allowed to ascend to the summit where elite residences and temples stood. After the walls, the city was starkly divided into two zones: the privileged interior, containing the major mounds, the plaza, elite residences, and the most important temples, all protected by the massive palisade, and the exterior zone, where common citizens lived in increasingly desperate circumstances, cut off from direct access to the ceremonial heart of the city and the rulers who claimed to protect them. This spatial segregation would have had powerful psychological effects. For the elite inside the walls, the palisade created an illusion of security and maintained their privileged access to whatever food reserves and luxury goods remained, allowing them to preserve their lifestyle even as the broader society suffered. But for commoners outside the walls, the message was unmistakable. You are expendable. Your suffering does not matter, and the rulers you have served will save themselves first. This kind of blatant inequality could only breed resentment and rage, potentially explaining the spike in violence during this period, not warfare between Cahokia and external enemies, but internal conflict between social classes, as the social contract that had held the city together for generations finally broke down under the pressure of environmental collapse and elite selfishness. Archaeological evidence suggests that life outside the walls became increasingly desperate as the 12th century turned into the 13th. Residential areas in the outer zones show signs of declining living standards. Houses become smaller and more poorly constructed. Exotic trade goods virtually disappear from household assemblages. Diet becomes more restricted and less nutritious based on bone chemistry analysis. Trash heaps from this period show people eating foods that earlier generations had avoided: small mammals like rats and mice, aquatic turtles and frogs, even dogs, which had previously been kept as pets or hunting companions rather than food sources. These are the dietary patterns of desperate people, eating whatever they can catch or scavenge, no longer able to maintain the cultural preferences that had distinguished them when times were good. Infant mortality rates spike dramatically, with some burial areas showing that more than half of children died before reaching age 5, a level of childhood death consistent with famine conditions. And perhaps most tellingly, some residential zones simply empty out during this period, houses abandoned mid-use with pottery and tools still in place, suggesting that inhabitants fled suddenly without taking their possessions, possibly in the middle of the night, to avoid being stopped by authorities who might have tried to prevent their departure. The archaeological signature is one of a society in collapse, where normal social relations have broken down and people are focused purely on individual survival. Inside the walls, life apparently continued with some semblance of normality, at least for a while. Elite residences show little evidence of declining standards during the early phases of the crisis. Exotic goods continue to appear in assemblages from high-status households, copper ornaments from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians, suggesting that trade networks were still functioning at some level and that elite families maintained access to luxury items even as commoners starved. Monumental construction continued, with repairs and modifications made to temples and elite residences atop the mounds. Religious ceremonies still took place in the Grand Plaza, though we can only imagine how they must have felt to the starving masses, excluded from the sacred precinct by the looming palisade. But this cannot have been a comfortable existence even for the elite. They would have seen the smoke from cooking fires declining in the outer residential zones as people fled or died. They would have noticed the increasingly desperate quality of the crowds that gathered outside the walls on ceremony days, no longer celebrating but demanding, pleading, perhaps threatening. They would have understood that their power rested on the labor and acquiescence of people who were no longer willing or able to provide either. The walls might protect them from immediate violence, but walls cannot solve the fundamental problem of a collapsing resource base and a population that has lost faith in its rulers. The religious implications of Cahokia's decline must have been devastating for a civilization whose entire ideological structure rested on the claim that rulers possessed supernatural power. Remember that Cahokia's explosive growth had been triggered partly by a supernova in 1054, interpreted as a divine sign mandating the construction of a great city. The ruling elite justified their authority by claiming special relationships with supernatural forces, demonstrated through their ability to predict celestial events using Woodhenge, to command the construction of monuments that touched the sky, and to maintain prosperity through their ritual activities. But now the rains were failing, the crops were dying, the forests were gone, and no amount of prayer or sacrifice seemed able to restore the bounty that had once flowed so easily. How could ordinary citizens continue to believe that their rulers possessed divine favor when the evidence all around them suggested the opposite, that the gods, if they existed, had abandoned Cahokia? The cognitive dissonance must have been enormous. Perhaps this explains the apparent increase in human sacrifice during Cahokia's decline, visible in burial mounds dating to the 13th century, where multiple individuals were killed and interred together in ways that suggest ritual rather than normal burial practices. Desperate rulers may have resorted to ever more extreme religious displays, sacrificing more people in increasingly elaborate ceremonies, trying to prove that they still commanded supernatural power and that the gods would return prosperity if only the rituals were performed correctly. But this strategy could not work indefinitely. At some point, people would conclude that no amount of sacrifice would help, that the rulers were charlatans whose claims of divine connection were lies, and that the only rational response was to leave, abandoning both the city and the failed gods it represented. The comparison with other historical civilizations facing similar crises is instructive and suggests that Cahokia's fate was not inevitable, but resulted from specific choices made by its ruling elite. The classic Maya collapse, which occurred several centuries earlier in Mesoamerica, followed a strikingly similar pattern: environmental degradation caused by deforestation and intensive agriculture, exacerbated by drought, leading to food shortages, social unrest, and eventually the abandonment of major cities. But some Maya cities survived the collapse by adapting, scaling back monumental construction, diversifying their economic base, decentralizing political power, while others clung to old patterns and vanished. Cahokia's rulers chose the latter path. They continued building walls when they should have been building granaries. They maintained their luxury lifestyles when they should have been distributing food to prevent starvation. They walled themselves off from their people when they should have been working to rebuild social trust. These were not inevitable choices forced by circumstances. They were decisions made by specific individuals who prioritized their own short-term survival and comfort over the long-term viability of their civilization. And when we ask why Cahokia collapsed, the answer is not just environmental degradation or climate change, though both played crucial roles. The answer is also human failure. The failure of leadership, the failure of imagination, the failure to adapt when adaptation was still possible. The walls stand as monuments to that failure, physical evidence of a ruling class that chose barriers over bridges, exclusion over inclusion, and ultimately chose wrong. By the middle of the 13th century, it would have been clear to any perceptive observer that Cahokia was dying. The population that had peaked at 50,000 around 1100 had declined to perhaps 20,000 by 1250 and was falling every year. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, wooden houses collapsing as rain rotted the thatched roofs and wind toppled the walls. Fields that had once grown corn lay fallow, reverting to weeds and scrub. The Grand Plaza, which had once hosted ceremonies attended by thousands, now saw only small, sparse gatherings, the empty space emphasizing how much had been lost. Trade, the lifeblood of Cahokia's economy, had diminished to a trickle as drought and social chaos disrupted exchange networks throughout the Mississippi Valley. Exotic goods that had once flowed through Cahokia's markets from all over the continent now bypassed the dying city entirely, traveling along new routes that avoided the dangerous, unpredictable situation in the Central Valley. And still the rulers clung to power, still they occupied the temples atop Monk's Mound, still they performed the ceremonies that were supposed to ensure cosmic order and earthly prosperity, even as evidence of their failure mounted around them. How long could this continue? When would the last true believer lose faith, the last loyal supporter defect, the last priest abandon the temples and flee into the countryside to seek survival elsewhere? The archaeological record suggests that this moment came sometime around 1350 AD, when even the elite finally acknowledged what had been obvious for a century. Cahokia was finished, the city could not be saved, and anyone who wanted to survive needed to leave while they still could. The final abandonment of Cahokia appears to have been relatively orderly, without the violence and destruction that marked the end of some ancient cities. There are no signs of a final siege, no evidence that invaders sacked the city and slaughtered its inhabitants. Instead, the archaeological signature suggests a gradual, almost dignified exodus, as the remaining population simply walked away from a city that could no longer sustain them. Elite residences atop the mounds were abandoned with valuables left in place, pottery, tools, ornaments, suggesting that people left voluntarily rather than fleeing in panic from an immediate threat. Temples were closed but not desecrated, their sacred objects apparently removed and presumably taken to wherever the priests were relocating, maintaining ritual continuity even as the physical site was abandoned. The walls, which had been so expensively maintained for a century, were left to rot, no longer necessary because there was nothing left worth protecting. And then, over the course of a few decades at most, the last inhabitants departed, leaving behind only silent mounds rising from an empty landscape, monuments to a civilization that had grown too large, consumed too much, adapted too slowly, and ultimately paid the ultimate price for its hubris. The great city that had once been home to 50,000 people was gone, and within 2 centuries, even the memory of who had built it and why they had left would fade into myth, leaving only questions that would perplex archaeologists for centuries to come, forcing us to wonder, if Cahokia could vanish so completely, what other civilizations might be just one crisis away from following the same tragic path? To understand why Cahokia's people were willing to abandon a city that had taken generations to build, we need to confront the darker aspects of Cahokian society that the monuments themselves tried to conceal. In the summer of 1967, archaeologist Melvin Fowler began excavating a low ridge-top mound about 800 meters south of Monk's Mound, a structure designated simply as Mound 72 in the site's cataloging system. Fowler expected to find the burial of an important leader, perhaps with a few grave goods and maybe some retainers, standard practice in many hierarchical societies where high-status individuals were occasionally buried with servants or sacrificial victims. What he found instead would fundamentally transform our understanding of Cahokian civilization and reveal that this society's grandeur came at a terrible human cost. At the center of the mound, excavators uncovered a man in his early 40s, lying on his back atop a platform made from more than 20,000 shell beads, each one laboriously crafted and transported from the Gulf of Mexico, 1,500 kilometers to the south. The beads had been arranged to form the shape of a falcon, a bird associated with warfare and supernatural power in many Native American cosmologies. But this man did not travel to the afterlife alone, and as Fowler's team carefully excavated outward from the central burial, they uncovered something that still disturbs archaeologists nearly 60 years later. This single individual had been accompanied in death by at least 272 other people, most of them killed specifically to be buried with him, their bodies arranged in distinct deposits that suggested different ritual purposes and different methods of death. The largest and most disturbing of these associated burials contained 53 young women, all between the ages of 15 and 25, arranged in 2 neat rows along the southern edge of the burial platform. Skeletal analysis revealed several consistent patterns across these women that tell a grim story about their final months or years. Many showed signs of severe vitamin D deficiency, the kind that develops when people are kept indoors for extended periods without exposure to sunlight, suggesting they had been held in some kind of captivity before death. Their bones showed evidence of hard physical labor, with stress markers on arm and backbones consistent with grinding corn or weaving textiles for hours every day. But what distinguishes this from normal agricultural labor is the combination with indoor confinement and the fact that they all died at the same moment, clearly killed for burial with the central figure. Some archaeologists have suggested these women might have been selected specifically for this purpose, perhaps years in advance, kept separate from the normal population and forced to work producing textiles or preparing food for elite consumption, until the moment came for them to fulfill their final, fatal obligation. The method of their death remains unclear. There are no obvious trauma marks on the bones, but the most likely explanation is strangulation or suffocation, which would leave no skeletal evidence. We can only imagine the terror these young women must have felt, knowing they had been marked for death, watching their numbers dwindle if the sacrifice happened in stages, waiting for their turn to die, so that a man they had probably never met could have servants in the afterlife. Another pit within Mound 72 contained an even more horrific deposit. 39 men and women buried in a mass grave with clear evidence of execution. Unlike the carefully arranged women in the primary deposit, these individuals had been dumped unceremoniously into a large pit, their bodies tangled together in the chaotic positions that result when multiple corpses are thrown into a hole without regard for dignity or ritual propriety. Many showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. They had been clubbed to death, possibly killed in a single mass execution. Some had their hands positioned in ways suggesting they had been bound at the time of death. None were buried with grave goods or in positions suggesting respect or honor. This was not sacrifice in the religious sense. This was slaughter, the disposal of people deemed unworthy of proper burial, perhaps criminals, prisoners of war, or slaves whose deaths were considered too insignificant to warrant individual graves. The contrast between these haphazardly buried individuals and the carefully arranged women is striking and reveals something important about Cahokian ideology. Even in death, social status mattered, with some victims worthy of ritual treatment, while others were simply waste to be disposed of efficiently. A third deposit in Mound 72 may be the most chilling of all. 4 young men whose heads and hands had been completely severed from their bodies and were not found anywhere in the burial complex. The remaining skeletal elements show no signs of battle trauma. These were not warriors who fell in combat and were then dismembered. Instead, the clean cuts through the cervical vertebrae and wrist bones suggest careful, deliberate decapitation and hand removal, probably performed post-mortem or on living victims who were immobilized. The heads and hands were clearly taken elsewhere, presumably for use in some ritual or display that required body parts separated from their source. This kind of systematic dismemberment points to a sophisticated sacrificial complex where different body parts had different symbolic meanings and different ritual uses, and where the practitioners were skilled enough to perform precise anatomical separations. We are not dealing with occasional impromptu violence. Here we are looking at an institutionalized system of human sacrifice that was planned, organized, and carried out by specialists who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times before. The total count from Mound 72 is staggering. At least 272 people buried with a single individual, representing the largest ceremonial killing ever documented in pre-Columbian North America north of Mexico. But here is what makes this discovery even more disturbing. Mound 72 is not unique. It is simply the best excavated and best documented example of a practice that archaeological evidence suggests was relatively common in Cahokian society, at least among the elite. Other mounds that have been partially investigated show similar patterns: high-status central burials surrounded by multiple sacrificial victims, though none have been excavated as thoroughly as Mound 72, and many were destroyed by farming and development before archaeologists could study them properly. If we extrapolate from the one mound we know in detail to the dozens of elite burial mounds that once existed at Cahokia, the total number of people sacrificed over the city's 300-year history could easily run into the thousands. This was not an aberration or an isolated atrocity. This was how the Cahokian elite did business, using spectacular displays of power over life and death to reinforce their authority and demonstrate their supposed connection to supernatural forces. The implications of Mound 72 for understanding Cahokian society are profound and deeply unsettling. This was not an egalitarian community of farmer-builders working together toward common goals, as some early romanticized accounts suggested. This was a rigidly hierarchical civilization with a powerful ruling class that could command the labor of thousands, demand the tribute of entire regions, and take hundreds of human lives whenever they deemed it necessary for political or religious purposes. The scale of human sacrifice suggests either extraordinary religious devotion on the part of the victims, a willingness to die for their faith and their leaders, or extraordinary coercion, with a ruling elite capable of forcing people to submit to death through a combination of ideological conditioning and physical force. Probably the reality involved both elements. Some victims may have gone willingly, believing that their sacrifice served a sacred purpose and would earn them favor in the afterlife, while others were clearly taken against their will, killed because they were convenient victims whose deaths reinforced elite power. Either way, the existence of this sacrificial system tells us that Cahokian society rested partly on fear, on the demonstrated willingness of the ruling class to kill anyone who opposed them or who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when a sacrifice was needed. But who was the man buried at the center of Mound 72, the individual deemed worthy of being accompanied in death by 272 sacrificial victims? We will never know his name, and we can only speculate about his role in Cahokian society based on the artifacts buried with him and the extraordinary expense lavished on his funeral. The falcon-shaped platform of 20,000 shell beads suggests a connection to warfare, and supernatural power falcons in many Native American traditions are associated with the sky, the sun, and the ability to see everything from a great height, metaphorically representing the all-seeing power of rulers. The sheer number of people killed for his burial suggests he was not merely an important leader, but someone whose death was considered a cosmic event requiring unprecedented ritual response. Some archaeologists have suggested he might have been the founder of Cahokian kingship, the individual who first successfully claimed divine authority and established the hereditary ruling dynasty that would dominate the city for generations. Others propose he was a particularly successful war leader whose military victories had expanded Cahokian power to its greatest extent. Still others suggest he might have been a religious innovator who introduced new rituals or new gods that transformed Cahokian spiritual life. Whatever his specific identity, his burial makes clear that by around 1000 AD, the approximate date of the Mound 72 burials, Cahokia had already developed a fully elaborated ideology of divine kingship, where rulers were not merely political leaders, but semi-divine figures whose importance justified extraordinary expenditures and whose deaths required human sacrifice on a scale that would shock even other hierarchical societies. The existence of institutionalized human sacrifice at Cahokia raises difficult questions about how we evaluate past civilizations and what we mean when we call a society advanced or sophisticated. By many measures, Cahokia was extraordinarily accomplished. Its architecture rivaled anything being built in Europe at the same time. Its astronomical knowledge allowed precise prediction of celestial events. Its trade networks connected regions thousands of kilometers apart. Its urban planning created a city that functioned efficiently with 50,000 inhabitants. But these achievements coexisted with practices that we would today consider horrific: the systematic killing of young women to serve dead elites, the execution of prisoners or slaves, and disposal of their bodies in mass graves, the dismemberment of victims for ritual purposes. How do we reconcile these two faces of Cahokian civilization? Perhaps the answer is that we should not try to reconcile them, but instead accept that human societies are complex, capable of both extraordinary creativity and extraordinary cruelty, sometimes within the same cultural system. The monuments that inspire our admiration today were built partly by forced labor, funded partly by tribute extracted through threats of violence, and dedicated partly through ceremonies that involved human sacrifice. We can appreciate Cahokian achievements while also acknowledging the human cost of those achievements and asking hard questions about whether such costs were necessary or whether they reflected specific choices made by elites who valued their own power more than the lives of common people. The practice of human sacrifice also helps explain a puzzle about Cahokia's eventual collapse. Why did people leave? If the city was simply experiencing environmental and economic difficulties, we might expect the population to decline gradually as people moved to areas with better resources. But the core of the city, the religious and political center, should have persisted, as long as people still believed in the ideology it represented. But if that ideology was based partly on fear, on the demonstrated willingness of rulers to kill anyone for any reason, then we would expect a different pattern. As soon as the rulers showed weakness, as soon as their ability to enforce obedience through violence declined, people would flee as quickly as possible to escape a system that had terrorized them for generations. This is exactly what the archaeological record shows. Cahokia did not decline gradually over centuries, it collapsed relatively rapidly over just a few generations, with the outer zones emptying first as people escaped the reach of elite violence, followed by the intermediate zones, and finally even the elite themselves abandoning the city when they could no longer maintain the coercive apparatus that sustained their power. The walls that went up in the 12th century were not just defending against external enemies, they were trying to contain a population that, given the chance, would vote with their feet and leave a system that had exploited and murdered them for centuries. Modern archaeological ethics have complicated our relationship with Mound 72 and similar burial sites in ways that reveal ongoing tensions about who controls the past. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, passed in 1990, human remains and certain cultural objects excavated from Native American sites must be returned to affiliated tribes for reburial if those tribes request it. This law represents an important correction to centuries of archaeological practice that treated Native American remains as specimens to be collected and studied without regard for the wishes of descendant communities. But it also creates challenges for scientific research. Once remains are reburied, they can no longer be studied using new techniques, and future generations of archaeologists will be unable to answer questions that we have not yet learned to ask. The Mound 72 remains were excavated before NAGPRA took effect, and many are still in museum collections where researchers can access them. But this situation could change at any time if affiliated tribes request repatriation. This creates a race against time for archaeologists who are trying to extract as much information as possible from these remains using techniques like DNA analysis, isotope geochemistry, and micro-CT scanning before the opportunity is potentially lost forever. It also forces us to confront fundamental questions about ownership of the past. Do the dead belong to their descendants, with rights that persist across centuries? Or do they belong to humanity as a whole, as sources of knowledge that can help us understand our collective history? There are no easy answers, only competing values and the need for respectful dialogue between archaeologists and native communities. The revelation of mass human sacrifice at Cahokia has led some popular writers to portray the civilization as uniquely bloodthirsty or barbaric, but this is neither accurate nor fair. Human sacrifice was practiced by many ancient civilizations, including some we continue to celebrate for their cultural achievements. The ancient Egyptians killed servants to bury with pharaohs during early dynasties. The Shang dynasty in China sacrificed prisoners by the hundreds. The ancient Greeks killed prisoners of war at funerals of important warriors. And of course, the Aztecs in Mesoamerica practiced human sacrifice on an industrial scale, killing thousands annually in ceremonies designed to maintain cosmic order. Cahokia's practices were horrific, but they were not unique. and they do not disqualify the civilization from being taken seriously or studied respectfully. What makes Cahokia particularly interesting is precisely this combination of sophisticated achievements and disturbing practices, because it forces us to grapple with the full complexity of human nature, rather than indulging in simplistic narratives about noble savages living in harmony with nature or primitive barbarians incapable of real civilization. The Cahokians were neither. They were people like us, capable of creating beauty and inflicting cruelty, building monuments and destroying lives, reaching toward the stars while standing on piles of bodies. Understanding them requires us to hold these contradictions in our minds simultaneously and resist the temptation to reduce them to simple stereotypes. As Cahokia entered its final century of occupation in the 1200s, the sacrificial system that had helped maintain elite power for generations was probably breaking down along with everything else. When times were good and resources were abundant, people might accept human sacrifice as the price of prosperity, believing that the gods demanded blood in exchange for rain, harvests, and peace. But when times turned bad, when drought killed the crops, when forests disappeared, when hunger stalked the city, the sacrifices would have seemed increasingly pointless and cruel. Why should young women die to serve dead kings when their labor was desperately needed by the living? Why should prisoners be executed when every able-bodied person was needed to work the fields or gather food from the depleted forests? The ideology that justified sacrifice rested on the claim that rulers possessed supernatural power and that their rituals maintained cosmic order, but environmental collapse undermined those claims, making it increasingly obvious that the sacrifices were not working, that the gods, if they existed, were not listening, and that the rulers were either powerless or frauds. We have no direct evidence of open rebellion at Cahokia, no signs of a revolution that overthrew the elite and established a new order. Instead, we see abandonment, people simply leaving, walking away from a system that no longer served them and no longer deserved their loyalty. And perhaps that was the most devastating judgment of all not violent overthrow, but quiet rejection, the silent verdict of thousands of individuals who decided that life anywhere else would be better than life under the shadow of the mounds where so many had died for the vanity of the powerful. The violence and coercion revealed in Mound 72 was only one pillar supporting Cahokia's power, and perhaps not even the most important one. After all, fear alone cannot sustain a civilization for 3 centuries or attract tens of thousands of willing migrants from across the continent. Something else drew people to Cahokia, something powerful enough to overcome the risk of exploitation and violence, something that made the gamble of leaving ancestral lands seem worthwhile. That something was economic opportunity, on a scale that no other location in North America could match. Cahokia was not just a religious center or a political capital. It was the commercial hub of a trading empire that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, connecting regions that had previously interacted only sporadically and transforming the economic geography of an entire continent. To understand why Cahokia rose so rapidly and why its collapse was so devastating, we need to understand the economic engine that powered it, the vast networks of exchange that channeled wealth through the city's markets, and the geographic accident that made all of this possible: 3 rivers meeting at a single point, creating the most strategically valuable location in pre-Columbian North America. Stand at the confluence where the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers meet, just a few kilometers north of where Monk's Mound rises from the floodplain, and you will understand immediately why this location became the site of North America's greatest pre-Columbian city. The Mississippi flows south from its headwaters in Minnesota, draining the entire eastern half of the continent and providing access to the Great Lakes region, the Ohio Valley, and the Gulf Coast. The Missouri flows east from the Rocky Mountains, connecting the Great Plains and providing routes to the rich hunting grounds of the western prairies. The Illinois flows southwest from the Great Lakes, linking Cahokia to the copper-rich regions of Michigan and Wisconsin. Any trader wanting to move goods between these regions had to pass through this confluence, and whoever controlled this confluence could tax, regulate, or prohibit trade as they wished. This was not merely a convenient location, this was a geographic choke point, a place where the natural transportation network of rivers funneled continental commerce through a single node that could be monopolized by anyone with sufficient power and organization. The Cahokians did not create this geographic advantage, but they were the first to recognize it and exploit it fully, transforming a favorable location into an economic empire that made them wealthy beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. The archaeological evidence for Cahokia's far-flung trade connections is overwhelming and comes from every residential area, every workshop, and every elite burial excavated at the site. Copper appears in both utilitarian objects like awls and fishhooks, and in elaborate ornamental pieces like the ear spools worn by high-status individuals, copper, that isotopic analysis traces to sources in the Great Lakes region, particularly the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan, over 1,000 kilometers to the north. Marine shells, both whole and worked into beads, ornaments, and ritual objects, come from Gulf Coast species that could only have been collected from waters near present-day Florida, Alabama, or Louisiana, 1,500 kilometers to the south. Mica, split into thin, translucent sheets and cut into elaborate geometric shapes or effigy forms, derives from sources in the Appalachian Mountains, particularly North Carolina and Tennessee, 1,000 kilometers to the east. Obsidian, the volcanic glass prized for its sharp cutting edges and lustrous black appearance, has been traced through chemical fingerprinting to sources in the Yellowstone region of Wyoming and the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, over 2,000 kilometers to the west and southwest. Galena, or lead ore, used for pigments and carved into small ornaments, comes from southeastern Missouri. Chert and other high-quality stone for making tools travels from quarries in Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. Even organic materials like bison hides and prairie grasses for weaving come from the Great Plains, hundreds of kilometers away. What makes this trade network even more remarkable is that the Cahokians accomplished it without any of the transportation technologies that made long-distance trade efficient in other parts of the world. They had no horses or oxen to pull carts, no camels to carry packs across prairies, no llamas to serve as pack animals in rough terrain. They had no wheeled vehicles because wheels are useless without draft animals to pull them. And North America had no suitable draft animals after the extinction of horses and camels at the end of the Ice Age. Everything had to be carried either on human backs, along footpaths, or in canoes paddled up and down rivers, slow, labor-intensive methods that limited the volume of trade and made long-distance exchange expensive. Yet despite these limitations, Cahokia managed to accumulate exotic goods from across the continent in quantities that suggest not occasional trade, but sustained, systematic exchange involving hundreds of traders making regular circuits between the city and distant sources of valuable materials. How did they organize this? We can only speculate, but the most plausible model involves specialized traders, possibly operating under elite sponsorship, who made annual or biannual trading expeditions to distant regions, establishing relationships with local suppliers, and gradually building the trust and reputation necessary for large-scale exchange. These traders would have been cultural intermediaries as well as merchants, learning multiple languages, navigating between different political systems, and carrying not just goods, but also ideas, religious concepts, and technological innovations. But trade requires more than just demand for exotic goods. It requires something to trade, some product or service that Cahokia could offer in exchange for the copper, shells, mica, and obsidian flowing into the city. This is where Cahokia's economic genius becomes apparent. The city's traders did not simply extract resources from surrounding regions through tribute or coercion, though that certainly happened to some extent. Instead, they developed specialized products that other regions wanted, creating a genuine exchange economy where both parties benefited and therefore had incentives to maintain trading relationships. The most important of these export products was probably salt. specifically the refined salt produced through evaporation of brine from saline springs in the American bottom near Cahokia. Salt was essential for preserving meat and fish in an era without refrigeration, making it a valuable commodity throughout North America. Archaeological evidence suggests Cahokian workers processed salt on an industrial scale, boiling brine in ceramic vessels to evaporate water and leave behind purified salt crystals. The ceramic vessels used for this purpose, large, thick-walled pots that could withstand repeated heating, appear in huge numbers in workshop areas near Cahokia, and broken sherds from these salt-making vessels are found at sites throughout the Midwest, indicating that Cahokian salt was being traded across hundreds of kilometers. Equally important was Cahokian pottery, which archaeological analysis shows was technically superior to ceramics produced in surrounding regions. Cahokian potters developed firing techniques that achieved higher temperatures than most other North American ceramic traditions, probably through more efficient kiln designs or better control of fuel and airflow during firing. The result was pottery that was harder, more durable, and less likely to crack or break during use. Functional advantages that made Cahokian vessels desirable for everyday cooking and storage. But Cahokian pottery was not just functional, it was also aesthetically sophisticated, with elaborate decorative motifs incised or painted on vessel surfaces, creating distinctive styles that were imitated throughout the Mississippi Valley. The wide distribution of Cahokian pottery styles suggests that other communities valued these vessels enough to either import them directly or copy the designs locally, indicating that Cahokian ceramic technology was influencing pottery production across a vast region. Some archaeologists have suggested that pottery itself might have been an export product, with Cahokian workshops producing vessels specifically for trade, though the heavy weight of ceramic makes it a less than ideal trade good for long-distance transport. More likely, Cahokian potters were exporting their knowledge and techniques, perhaps traveling to other communities to teach local craftspeople or training apprentices who then returned to their home regions, spreading Cahokian ceramic technology throughout the trade network. The strategic control of river transportation gave Cahokia enormous power over the flow of goods throughout the Mississippi Valley, but this power came with corresponding vulnerabilities that would eventually prove fatal. A city that lives by trade can also die by trade, because economic power is only as strong as the networks that sustain it, and those networks can be disrupted by environmental change, political instability, or competition from rivals. During Cahokia's golden age in the 11th and early 12th centuries, the river system functioned reliably. Water levels remained high enough for easy canoe transport, seasonal floods were predictable, and political stability throughout the region meant that traders could travel safely between communities. But as the 12th century progressed into the 13th, all of these favorable conditions began to deteriorate. The drought that began around 1150 lowered water levels throughout the Mississippi system, making river transport more difficult and forcing traders to portage their canoes around exposed sandbars and rapids that had previously been navigable. Seasonal floods became less predictable, sometimes failing entirely or arriving at unexpected times, disrupting the agricultural cycles that people relied on for subsistence and making it harder to predict when surplus food would be available for trade. And as environmental stress increased throughout the region, political stability broke down, with warfare and raiding becoming more common and making long-distance trade dangerous and unpredictable. Cahokia's economic model had been built on the assumption of abundant resources and stable conditions, and it was catastrophically vulnerable to the kind of systemic environmental crisis that struck in the late 12th century. As drought reduced agricultural productivity throughout the region, communities had less surplus to trade and became more focused on local subsistence, reducing their participation in long-distance exchange networks. As forests disappeared around Cahokia and other major population centers, fuel for pottery production became scarce and expensive, reducing the competitive advantage that Cahokian ceramics had enjoyed. As social tensions increased and violence became more common, traders faced higher risks and demanded higher compensation for their journeys, raising the transaction costs of long-distance exchange and making it less profitable. And as Cahokia's own population declined and its markets shrank, the city became less attractive as a trading destination, creating a vicious cycle where declining trade reduced the city's wealth and importance, which further reduced trade, which further reduced wealth, spiraling downward toward economic collapse. By the mid-13th century, exotic goods largely disappear from archaeological assemblages at Cahokia, suggesting that long-distance trade networks had collapsed or were bypassing the city entirely, routing goods through other centers that remained viable. The collapse of trade networks had cascading effects throughout Cahokian society, undermining every aspect of the city's power and prosperity. The ruling elite derived much of their wealth and legitimacy from their ability to control the flow of exotic goods, which they used both for personal consumption and for redistribution to followers and allies, creating networks of obligation and loyalty. When trade dried up, the elite lost access to the luxury goods that marked their status, the copper ornaments, marine shell beads, and mica effigies that distinguished them visually from commoners. Without these status markers, their claims to special authority became harder to justify, and ambitious rivals could challenge them more easily. The religious specialists who performed ceremonies using exotic materials found themselves unable to access the copper sheets, shell trumpets, and galena pigments that their rituals required, undermining the spectacular theatrical displays that had helped maintain popular belief in elite supernatural power. Craft specialists who had depended on exotic raw materials, the copper workers, shell carvers, and mica cutters who produced the prestige goods that elite patrons commissioned, lost their livelihoods and either had to find new occupations or emigrate to other centers where their skills remained in demand. And common citizens who had been drawn to Cahokia partly by the economic opportunities the city offered the chance to participate in trade, to acquire exotic goods, to work in craft production, now found that those opportunities had evaporated, making Cahokia no more attractive and possibly less attractive than smaller communities that had maintained more sustainable relationships with their local environments. Modern economic historians studying Cahokia's trade networks have drawn comparisons with other pre-industrial trading empires and found striking parallels in both their success and their vulnerability. The Hanseatic League of medieval Northern Europe controlled trade routes across the Baltic Sea, accumulating enormous wealth by serving as intermediaries between Scandinavian suppliers and Western European markets, but the League declined rapidly when new trade routes opened that bypassed their controlled ports. The ancient city of Petra in Jordan thrived for centuries by controlling caravan routes through the Arabian desert, but it collapsed almost overnight when Roman engineers built roads that allowed traders to avoid the city's tolls. The Swahili trading cities of medieval East Africa grew wealthy by connecting African interior kingdoms with Indian Ocean maritime trade, but many declined when Portuguese ships opened direct routes that eliminated the need for African intermediaries. In each case, a city or network of cities prospered by monopolizing a crucial node in a larger trading system, accumulating wealth and power disproportionate to their actual productivity. But this prosperity was fundamentally fragile because it depended on maintaining control over routes and relationships that could shift rapidly in response to technological change, political developments, or environmental disruptions. Cahokia followed this same pattern, rising rapidly when it successfully monopolized the Mississippi River confluence, and falling just as rapidly when environmental collapse and political fragmentation disrupted the networks it had controlled. The irony of Cahokia's situation is that the city's very success as a trading hub contributed to its environmental collapse, creating a feedback loop that ultimately destroyed the foundations of its prosperity. Trade brought wealth. Wealth supported population growth. Population growth increased resource consumption degraded the environment. Environmental degradation undermined the resource base, and the deteriorating resource base made trade less viable, reducing wealth and starting the cycle over at a lower level of prosperity. By the time Cahokian leaders recognized the pattern, if they ever did recognize it, the city was too large, too specialized, and too dependent on trade to make the adjustments necessary for long-term sustainability. Scaling back would have meant acknowledging failure, losing political support, and potentially triggering exactly the kind of social chaos that leaders were trying to prevent. So they continued with business as usual, hoping that conditions would improve, that rain would return, that trade would revive, that somehow they could maintain their position without making fundamental changes to a system that was clearly unsustainable. This is a pattern that recurs throughout human history, civilizations continuing on destructive paths, not because leaders are stupid or ignorant, but because the short-term costs of changing course seem higher than the long-term costs of continuing, even when that calculation is ultimately proven wrong by events. By the middle of the 13th century, Cahokia's economy had contracted to a fraction of its former scale, transforming a once cosmopolitan trading metropolis into an isolated regional center struggling to maintain even local exchange networks. The Grand Plaza, which had once hosted markets where traders from across the continent displayed exotic wares, now saw only small local transactions as people bartered agricultural surplus for basic necessities. The craft workshops that had once employed hundreds of specialists producing prestige goods for elite patrons and long-distance trade now stood empty, their tools abandoned as craftspeople either died, fled, or turned to subsistence farming. The river landing where hundreds of canoes had once clustered, their crews haggling over prices and exchanging news from distant regions, now saw only occasional local traffic as people traveled short distances to fish or gather resources from nearby areas. And the elite residences atop the mounds, once filled with exotic treasures from across North America, now contained mostly locally produced goods. The few remaining copper ornaments and shell beads carefully hoarded remnants of better times, symbols of a vanished prosperity that no one knew how to restore. The city that had once been the economic heart of a continent was dying, and its death would send shockwaves throughout North America as communities that had structured their economies around supplying Cahokia suddenly found their primary customer gone, forcing rapid readjustments that disrupted societies throughout the Mississippi Valley and beyond. The collapse of Cahokia's trading empire demonstrates a fundamental truth about complex societies that remains relevant today. Economic specialization creates efficiency and prosperity under favorable conditions, but it also creates vulnerability and fragility when conditions change. A diversified economy can weather disruptions by shifting resources from declining sectors to expanding ones, but a specialized economy that depends on a few key activities has nowhere to pivot when those activities become unviable. Cahokia had specialized heavily in trade and craft production, activities that generated wealth efficiently when conditions were stable, but that collapsed rapidly when environmental changes disrupted the networks they depended on. A more diversified economic strategy, maintaining stronger agricultural production, preserving forests for long-term resource extraction, keeping population at sustainable levels might have allowed Cahokia to survive the crisis in reduced form, but that would have meant accepting less wealth and power during the good times, a trade-off that few successful societies are willing to make. We face similar choices today. Do we maximize short-term efficiency and growth by specializing and globalizing our economies, accepting the increased vulnerability that comes with those strategies? Or do we sacrifice some efficiency to maintain resilience and diversity, accepting lower growth rates in exchange for greater stability? Cahokia's ruins suggest that the trade-off is real, and that societies that choose efficiency over resilience do so at their peril, because when the crisis comes, and eventually, the crisis always comes, specialized systems collapse faster and more completely than diversified ones, leaving behind only monuments and questions for future archaeologists to puzzle over as they try to understand why something that seemed so successful could fail so completely. To truly grasp what was lost when Cahokia's economy collapsed and its population scattered, we need to understand what the city looked like at the height of its power around 1100 AD, because this was not a collection of scattered villages or a temporary ceremonial center, but a genuine urban metropolis with sophisticated planning, complex infrastructure, and a scale that rivaled the greatest cities of medieval Europe. While the trading networks were bringing exotic goods from across the continent and the elite were demonstrating their power through human sacrifice atop the mounds, the vast majority of Cahokia's 50,000 inhabitants were living out their daily lives in a carefully organized urban environment that modern archaeologists are only now beginning to fully appreciate. The city was not randomly sprawled across the landscape. As villages expanded organically into one another, it was deliberately planned and laid out according to principles that reflect sophisticated understanding of urban design, social organization, and the practical challenges of housing tens of thousands of people in a relatively compact area. The Grand Plaza alone covered 20 hectares, making it larger than 30 modern football fields. And this was merely the central public space around which the rest of the city was organized in concentric zones of decreasing status and importance, radiating outward from the sacred precinct at the heart. The most striking feature of Cahokian urban planning, visible even today in aerial photographs and ground-penetrating radar surveys, is the rigid grid system that organized much of the residential and commercial areas. Unlike the organic, winding street patterns that characterize most pre-industrial cities, where buildings are added piecemeal over generations without overall coordination, Cahokia's streets ran in straight lines aligned with the cardinal directions, creating rectangular blocks that could be subdivided systematically into individual household plots. The main boulevards were massive, up to 30 meters wide, far broader than necessary for pedestrian traffic, suggesting they served multiple purposes beyond simple transportation. These wide streets allowed large crowds to move efficiently during ceremonial occasions when the entire population might be processing toward the Grand Plaza for religious festivals. They provided fire breaks that would slow the spread of flames if one of the wooden structures caught fire, a crucial safety feature in a city of 50,000 people living in timber houses with thatched roofs. And they served as symbolic statements about Cahokian power and organization, visible demonstrations that this was not a haphazard settlement, but a planned capital built according to cosmic principles, with streets aligned to the rising and setting sun, just as the major mounds were oriented to celestial events. The Grand Plaza itself was an engineering marvel and the social heart of Cahokian civilization, a vast rectangular open space covering approximately 20 hectares where the entire population could assemble for major ceremonies, markets, games, and political gatherings. Creating and maintaining such a large, flat open space in the Mississippi floodplain required constant work. Archaeological evidence shows that Cahokian laborers periodically brought in loads of clay and sand to resurface the plaza, building up the level gradually over decades to keep it above flood stage and maintain a smooth surface suitable for public gatherings. The edges of the plaza were defined by wooden palisades in some periods and by earthen berms in others, creating a clear boundary between sacred public space and ordinary residential areas. Archaeologists have found evidence of chunky courts carved into the plaza surface, long, narrow playing fields for a game that involved rolling stone discs and throwing spears, a sport that was popular throughout the Mississippian world and that apparently drew large audiences who gambled on the outcomes. The plaza also functioned as a marketplace where traders displayed goods, farmers sold surplus crops, and craftspeople offered their wares, creating a commercial center that drew people from throughout the region and reinforced Cahokia's role as the economic hub of the Mississippi Valley. Residential neighborhoods in Cahokia were organized hierarchically, with clear spatial segregation between elite districts, middle-status craft producer zones, and commoner residential areas. The highest-status residences clustered near Monk's Mound and other major ceremonial structures, occupying elevated positions that provided both symbolic dominance, looking down on the common population, and practical advantages like better drainage and protection from flooding. Archaeological excavation of elite residential areas reveals larger houses constructed with more care and better materials, with evidence of specialized structures like storage buildings, workshops for attached craft specialists, and small private temples or shrines. Exotic trade goods appear in high concentrations in elite household assemblages. Copper ornaments, marine shell beads, mica effigies, even the occasional piece of obsidian or turquoise from thousands of kilometers away. Middle-status households, probably belonging to successful craft producers, merchants, and religious specialists who were not part of the hereditary elite, but who had achieved comfortable prosperity, occupied intermediate zones with good access to the central plaza, but clearly separated from the highest status areas. Their houses were smaller than elite residences, but still substantial, and their artifact assemblages show modest amounts of exotic goods mixed with locally produced items, suggesting they could afford some luxuries, but not the lavish displays of the true elite. The common residential districts, where the vast majority of Cahokia's population lived, stretched outward from the city center in expanding rings, eventually covering an area of approximately 13 square kilometers at the city's maximum extent. Archaeological survey suggests that population density varied considerably across these zones, with some neighborhoods tightly packed and others more loosely settled, perhaps reflecting different ethnic groups maintaining some degree of residential separation, even while participating in the larger urban community. Houses in commoner neighborhoods were typically small single-room structures, roughly square or rectangular, built with a framework of wooden posts set in the ground and walls made of woven mats plastered with clay, topped with thatched roofs. Floors were usually packed earth, sometimes covered with reed mats for comfort and insulation. Each house would have contained a central hearth for cooking and heating, sleeping platforms along the walls, and storage areas for food, tools, and personal possessions. Families probably spent most of their waking hours outdoors when weather permitted, using their houses primarily for sleeping, shelter from weather, and storage, a pattern typical of pre-industrial societies in temperate climates where indoor space is expensive to build and maintain. The infrastructure required to support 50,000 people in this urban environment was substantial and required constant maintenance by specialized work crews. Drainage was a critical concern in the low-lying floodplain where Cahokia was situated, and archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated systems of ditches, channels, and berms designed to move water away from residential areas and prevent flooding during spring high water. Some of these drainage features were massive undertakings, requiring organized labor crews to excavate channels hundreds of meters long and several meters deep, moving thousands of cubic meters of earth. Water supply was presumably drawn from the Mississippi River and smaller streams that flowed through the urban area, though the lack of ceramic water jars in household assemblages suggests people may have used organic containers like leather bags or woven baskets that would not survive in the archaeological record. Waste disposal was probably handled informally by individual households, with organic waste tossed into pits or simply scattered in middens near residences, a system that would have created sanitation problems as population density increased and contributed to the spread of diseases that skeletal evidence suggests were becoming more common in Cahokia's later phases. When we compare Cahokia at its height around 1100 AD to contemporary cities in other parts of the world, the scale of the achievement becomes truly apparent. London at the same time had a population of perhaps 30 to 40,000, making Cahokia significantly larger. Paris might have had 50,000 inhabitants, putting it roughly equal to Cahokia, but in a region with vastly greater technological resources, including metal tools, wheeled vehicles, draft animals, and a written language for record-keeping and coordination. Most cities in medieval Europe were far smaller, with populations in the low thousands, and even major centers like Rome had not yet recovered from their collapse centuries earlier. In the Islamic world, cities like Cairo and Baghdad were larger than Cahokia, but they were supported by agricultural systems that had been refined over millennia and by long-distance trade networks that connected 3 continents. In China, cities like Kaifeng dwarfed Cahokia, with populations in the hundreds of thousands, but again, they represented the culmination of thousands of years of urban development in a society with advanced metallurgy, sophisticated administrative systems, and extensive written records. Cahokia achieved a scale comparable to these old-world cities while working within far greater technological constraints, suggesting that the organizational and administrative capabilities of Cahokian society were extraordinarily advanced, perhaps rivaling or exceeding those of contemporary civilizations with superior material technology. The daily life of a typical Cahokian resident would have been shaped by the urban environment in ways that distinguished city dwellers from their rural counterparts in surrounding villages. Unlike rural farmers who spent most of their time in agricultural labor, producing most of what they consumed directly, urban Cahokians would have been far more specialized and dependent on exchange. A craft producer might spend his days working copper into ornaments or grinding shell into beads, producing items for exchange rather than for direct consumption. A woman might specialize in pottery production, spending her time mining clay, processing it, forming vessels, decorating them, and firing them in kilns, then trading the finished products for food, clothing, and other necessities. Some residents were probably full-time religious specialists, maintaining temples, conducting ceremonies, and training apprentices in ritual knowledge. Others served as administrators, tracking tribute and trade, settling disputes, and coordinating the labor crews that maintained public infrastructure. Still others were essentially service workers, providing labor for construction projects, hauling water, cutting wood, processing food, and performing the countless tasks necessary to keep a large urban population functioning. This degree of specialization was only possible because Cahokia's agricultural hinterland produced sufficient surplus to support thousands of non-farming urban residents, and because the city's trading networks brought in additional resources from across the continent to supplement local production. The social complexity required to coordinate 50,000 people in this urban environment is staggering when we remember that Cahokia had no written language, no formal bureaucracy with written records, no standardized currency, and no police force in the modern sense. How did leaders communicate decisions to the population? How did they track tribute obligations and ensure that outlying communities provided their share of food to feed the urban population? How did they organize the labor crews that maintained infrastructure and constructed monuments? How did they adjudicate disputes and enforce laws? We can only speculate, but the most plausible answers involve a combination of oral tradition, religious authority, kinship obligations, and credible threats of violence. Important decisions and laws were probably memorized and transmitted orally by specialized officials, perhaps in formal verse or chant that made accurate memorization easier. Tribute obligations may have been tracked using quipu-like knotted strings or tally sticks that served as mnemonic devices for officials who knew how to read them. Labor organization probably relied heavily on kinship ties, with extended family groups responsible for contributing their share of workers to public projects, and community leaders acting as intermediaries between their followers and the central authority. Dispute resolution might have combined religious arbitration by priests who claimed supernatural authority with more pragmatic enforcement by warriors loyal to the elite. It was a delicate system, dependent on maintaining consensus about the legitimacy of authority and about the benefits that justified the costs of urban living. As long as Cahokia delivered prosperity-abundant food, protection from enemies, access to exotic goods through trade, impressive ceremonies that suggested the gods favored the city, most people would have accepted the system and their place within it. But as we have seen, the environmental and climatic crises of the 12th century undermined every basis of that acceptance. Food became scarce instead of abundant. Trade collapsed, cutting off access to exotic goods. Ceremonies became hollow performances that no longer convinced anyone the gods were listening. And the construction of defensive walls made explicit what had previously been implicit. The elite were protecting themselves at everyone else's expense, transforming a social contract based on mutual benefit into naked coercion backed by violence. The sophisticated urban infrastructure that had seemed like evidence of Cahokian superiority, the grid streets, the drainage systems, the massive plaza became liabilities in the context of collapse. Dense urban population meant that when food became scarce, starvation spread rapidly. Sophisticated infrastructure required constant maintenance that nobody could afford to provide, as labor was redirected to more immediate survival needs. The plaza that had hosted joyous markets and ceremonies became a space of desperation where hungry people gathered to demand food from leaders who had none to give. The contrast between Cahokia at its height and Cahokia in its final decades must have been psychologically devastating for anyone who lived through the transition. Imagine being born around 1100 AD in the greatest city in North America, a metropolis larger than London, with bustling markets, impressive ceremonies, monumental architecture, and a sense that Cahokia was the center of the universe. destined to endure forever. Then watch as over your lifetime everything gradually falls apart. Trade declining, food becoming scarce, neighborhoods emptying, walls going up to separate the elite from the commoners, violence increasing, religious ceremonies becoming more desperate and less convincing. By the time you reached old age around 1160 or 1170, you would be living in a city that bore little resemblance to the glorious capital of your youth, watching your grandchildren grow up malnourished and hopeless in a society that had lost faith in its own future. This kind of civilizational collapse is not just a material phenomenon measured in declining population and abandoned buildings, it is a psychological trauma that affects everyone who experiences it, destroying the assumptions and expectations that gave meaning to people's lives and leaving them adrift in a world that no longer makes sense. The ruins of Cahokia are ruins not just of buildings, but of shattered dreams, of a future that people had every reason to believe in, but that history cruelly denied them, transforming what should have been humanity's triumph into one of archaeology's most haunting mysteries. The ultimate irony of Cahokia's urban sophistication is that it made the city more vulnerable, not less, to the kind of systemic crisis that struck in the 12th century. A small village can adapt quickly to changing conditions. If crops fail in one area, people can move to another. If trade networks collapse, they can return to local self-sufficiency. If population grows too large for local resources, some families can split off and found new settlements. But a city of 50,000 cannot adapt so easily. Population density is too high to allow a return to hunting and gathering or extensive agriculture. Infrastructure investments are too large to abandon lightly. The effort spent building mounds, plazas, and defensive walls creates sunk costs that leaders are reluctant to write off. Social specialization means that most residents lack the skills needed for self-sufficient rural life and depend on the continuation of urban markets and exchange. Political centralization means that decisions must be made by elite consensus rather than by individual households adapting to local circumstances, slowing response times and creating opportunities for destructive political conflicts. In short, the same features that made Cahokia successful during the expansion phase, density, specialization, centralization, infrastructure investment, became fatal weaknesses during the contraction phase, turning what might have been a manageable adjustment into a catastrophic collapse that destroyed the greatest city ancient North America ever produced and scattered its population to the winds, leaving behind only silent mounds and questions that archaeologists are still struggling to answer nearly a millennium later. The vulnerability that Cahokia's urban complexity created would have remained merely theoretical if external conditions had remained stable. But around 1150 AD, nature began delivering a series of devastating blows that transformed theoretical vulnerability into actual catastrophe. The environmental crisis that ultimately destroyed Cahokia did not arrive suddenly as a single dramatic event. No volcanic eruption, no earthquake, no plague that swept through in a single season, leaving bodies in its wake. Instead, it was a slow-motion apocalypse unfolding over decades, a gradual degradation of the resource base that supported the city, happening so incrementally that each year's decline seemed manageable, even as the cumulative effect was devastating. By the time leaders recognized the full scale of the crisis, if they ever did, it was far too late to reverse course. The city had grown too large, stripped its hinterland too thoroughly, and become too dependent on unsustainable resource extraction to survive the combination of human-caused environmental degradation and climate-driven drought that converged in the 12th century to create perfect conditions for civilizational collapse. The story of Cahokia's environmental destruction begins not with the crisis of the 12th century, but with the city's founding and explosive growth in the late 10th and 11th centuries. When the first permanent settlers arrived in the American bottom around 900 AD, they found a landscape of extraordinary natural abundance. Dense hardwood forests of oak, hickory, walnut, and maple, covering the bluffs that rose on either side of the Mississippi floodplain, providing habitat for deer, elk, turkey, and countless smaller animals, the river itself teeming with fish and freshwater mussels, wetlands and oxbow lakes supporting migratory waterfowl, and rich alluvial soils in the floodplain itself, renewed annually by spring floods that deposited nutrient-rich sediment ideal for agriculture. This was a landscape that could easily support a small population practicing mixed subsistence. Some agriculture, some hunting, some gathering with minimal environmental impact. But Cahokia at its height was not a small population, and its inhabitants were not practicing low-impact subsistence. They were trying to support 50,000 people in a concentrated urban area, building massive monuments that required enormous quantities of timber and feeding themselves primarily through intensive agriculture that demanded continuous clearing of new fields as old ones lost fertility. Core samples extracted from lake beds and wetlands in the American bottom provide a detailed environmental history that reads like an autopsy report, documenting the slow death of an ecosystem under human pressure. Before 1000 AD, pollen analysis shows tremendous botanical diversity, over 200 different plant species identifiable from their distinctive pollen grains, indicating a mature, stable ecosystem with multiple layers of vegetation from canopy trees down through understory shrubs to ground-level herbs and grasses. Oak and hickory dominate the tree pollen, as expected in a mature eastern hardwood forest, but dozens of other tree species appear in smaller quantities, showing the kind of diversity that characterizes healthy forests. Charcoal particles in the sediment cores are rare, indicating that forest fires were infrequent and limited in extent. The pollen from agricultural plants like corn, beans, and squash is present, but represents a tiny fraction of total pollen, showing that farming was happening, but at a small scale that had minimal impact on the broader landscape. This was a landscape in balance, with human activity fitting within ecological constraints rather than pushing against them. By 1050 AD, just 50 years later, the pollen profile has changed dramatically in ways that document an environmental transformation unprecedented in the region's history. Oak and hickory pollen decline by more than half, replaced by pollen from weedy species ragweed, goosefoot, and various grasses that colonize disturbed ground after forests are cleared. Charcoal particles increase dramatically, indicating widespread burning as Cahokians used fire to clear land for agriculture and to manage vegetation around the growing city. Agricultural plant pollen increases proportionally, showing that farming had expanded from a minor subsistence activity to a major land use that was reshaping the entire landscape. Most tellingly, the sediment itself changes character. Before 1000 AD, lake sediments are dark and organic rich, indicating stable soils and minimal erosion. After 1050 AD, sediments become lighter and more mineral rich, showing that soil was eroding from cleared hillsides and washing into lakes and rivers, carrying away the fertility that agriculture depended on. Within just 2 generations, the Cahokians had fundamentally altered an ecosystem that had been stable for thousands of years, stripping away forests, degrading soils, and setting in motion ecological changes that would take centuries to reverse, even if human pressure had been immediately removed. By 1100 AD, at the very height of Cahokia's power and population, the environmental situation had deteriorated further, approaching ecological collapse. Tree pollen represents less than 20% of total pollen in sediment cores, showing that the landscape had been transformed from forest to open country, dotted with isolated tree patches. The diversity of tree species crashes from dozens to just a handful, indicating that Cahokians were selectively harvesting the most useful species: oak for construction, hickory for tool handles, walnut for its edible nuts, leaving behind only species that had little practical value. Erosion indicators reach their peak, with sediment accumulation rates in lake beds increasing by a factor of 5 compared to pre-Cahokian levels, showing that topsoil was washing away faster than it could form, a process that would eventually make agriculture impossible in affected areas. Wildlife populations were clearly declining based on changes in faunal remains from archaeological sites. Deer and elk bones become less common relative to smaller animals like rabbits and raccoons, suggesting that large game had been hunted intensively and were becoming scarce. Turkey bones show signs of domestication, indicating that Cahokians could no longer rely on hunting wild turkeys and had begun raising them in captivity. And fish bones shift towards smaller, less desirable species, showing that overfishing was depleting preferred species and forcing people to consume second-choice alternatives. The scale of deforestation required to build and maintain Cahokia is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. Constructing the major mounds did not require timber, they were earthen structures, but everything else in the city did. Each house required dozens of wooden posts for its frame, wooden beams for roof supports, and thousands of wooden stakes to support the woven mat walls. A typical house might incorporate timber from 20 to 30 mature trees, and Cahokia at its peak probably contained 10,000 or more houses, meaning that residential construction alone required harvesting 200 to 300,000 trees, stripping bare something like 20 square kilometers of forest just for housing. The temples and elite residences atop the mounds were larger and more elaborate than ordinary houses, consuming proportionally more timber. The defensive palisade that was built and rebuilt 4 times required approximately 15,000 large trees per iteration, or 60,000 trees total across all rebuildings. Woodhenge, rebuilt at least 5 times, consumed hundreds of massive posts each time. The wooden framework, internal to some mounds as structural reinforcement, used thousands more trees, and this accounts only for construction. It does not include the ongoing consumption of fuel wood for cooking, heating, pottery firing, and other daily activities that required every household to burn substantial quantities of wood every single day. If we attempt a rough calculation of Cahokia's total timber consumption over its 300-year occupation, the numbers are staggering. Assume 50,000 people at peak population, declining to an average of perhaps 30,000 over the full occupation period. Assume each person required the equivalent of 1 mature tree per year for fuel wood and other needs, probably a conservative estimate. That alone equals 9 million trees over 300 years, enough to completely deforest roughly 400 square kilometers of mature hardwood forest. Add in construction timber, and the total easily exceeds 10 million trees, requiring clear-cutting of an area larger than modern Rhode Island. And this timber had to come from forests within reasonable transportation distance of the city. Cahokians could not haul logs from hundreds of kilometers away, meaning the immediate hinterland of Cahokia was almost completely stripped of trees by the 13th century. Archaeological and paleoecological evidence confirms this calculation. By 1200 AD, there were essentially no forests left within 50 kilometers of the city, forcing residents to travel long distances for even basic fuel wood, making construction of new buildings prohibitively expensive and eliminating the game animals that depended on forest habitat for survival. The deforestation had cascading ecological effects that went far beyond the simple loss of trees. Without forest cover, the landscape lost its ability to retain water, making flooding more severe during wet periods and droughts more extreme during dry periods. Soils that had been stabilized by tree roots began eroding during rainstorms, washing into rivers and streams, and degrading water quality while simultaneously stripping away the fertility that agriculture required. Local climate changed as the landscape lost the moderating influence of forests. Summers became hotter because there was no tree canopy to provide shade, and winters became colder because there was no forest cover to trap warmth and protect against wind. Species that depended on forest ecosystems disappeared entirely from the region, including not just large mammals like deer and elk, but also birds, insects, and plants that formed complex ecological relationships with forest trees. The rivers themselves changed character as increased erosion filled channels with sediment, making them shallower and less navigable, complicating the river transport that Cahokia's trade networks depended on. And perhaps most critically, the loss of forests made the city increasingly vulnerable to drought, because forests help maintain local precipitation. Through transpiration, the release of water vapor from leaves, and without forests, the region became drier and more susceptible to climatic variations that might have been buffered if the natural vegetation had remained intact. And then, just as Cahokia's self-inflicted environmental damage was reaching critical levels, nature delivered a knockout blow in the form of a prolonged drought that began around 1150 AD and lasted, with brief intermissions, for approximately 50 years. Tree ring records from across North America document this drought in remarkable detail, showing annual growth rings that are unusually narrow, indicating water stress that limited tree growth year after year across multiple decades. The drought was part of a broader climatic shift toward cooler, drier conditions throughout the Northern Hemisphere, sometimes called the medieval climate anomaly or the early phase of the Little Ice Age, driven by changes in solar radiation, volcanic activity, and ocean circulation patterns that scientists are still working to fully understand. For Cahokia, the specific mechanism behind the drought mattered far less than its effects. The Mississippi River dropped to levels not recorded in living memory, making river transport difficult and reducing the productivity of floodplain agriculture that depended on annual spring floods. Precipitation declined by perhaps 20 to 30% compared to the previous century, causing crop failures and making it impossible to sustain intensive agriculture in marginal areas. And temperatures became more variable and unpredictable, with late spring frosts and early fall freezes reducing the length of the growing season and introducing new uncertainties into agricultural planning. The combination of human-caused deforestation and climate-driven drought created conditions that were catastrophically worse than either factor alone would have produced. A landscape with intact forests might have weathered a 50-year drought with some difficulty, but without civilizational collapse, forests buffer against drought by retaining soil moisture, maintaining local precipitation through transpiration, and providing alternative food sources like nuts and game animals when agriculture fails. Similarly, even severe deforestation might have been survivable under normal climatic conditions. People could have adapted by importing food from neighboring regions, shifting to less timber-intensive housing, or reducing population to match reduced carrying capacity. But deforestation plus drought together created a perfect storm where neither adaptation was possible. There was no surplus to import because the drought affected the entire region. There were no forests left to provide alternative resources, and reducing population would have required mass emigration or mass mortality, both of which would have triggered the collapse of the political system that depended on population size for its power and legitimacy. Cahokian leaders found themselves facing a crisis with no good options, only a choice between different forms of catastrophe. The archaeological record documents the human consequences of this environmental catastrophe in heartbreaking detail. Skeletal remains from burial sites dating to 1150–1250 AD show dramatic increases in malnutrition indicators, linear enamel hypoplasias on teeth, horizontal grooves showing that tooth development was interrupted by periods of severe malnutrition during childhood, porotic hyperostosis in cranial bones, a spongy appearance caused by anemia and nutritional deficiencies, and reduced stature compared to earlier and later populations, showing that chronic malnutrition during growth years prevented people from reaching their genetic height potential. Child mortality rates spike dramatically, with some burial populations showing that more than half of children died before age 5, and those who survived often showed signs of repeated illness and malnutrition. Adult skeletons show increased evidence of infectious diseases, osteomyelitis, periostitis, and other conditions that suggest immune systems compromised by malnutrition made people vulnerable to pathogens that healthy individuals would have fought off. Violence-related injuries become far more common, with fractured skulls, broken arms in defensive positions, and healed wounds that show people surviving violent encounters only to face them again later. This is the skeletal signature of a population under severe stress, struggling to survive in conditions that were pushing human endurance to its limits. But perhaps the most poignant evidence of Cahokia's environmental crisis comes from what we might call the archaeology of desperation. The material traces of people making increasingly extreme choices as their options narrowed. Faunal remains from trash heaps dating to the late occupation show people eating foods they had previously avoided. Small mammals like rats, mice, and groundhogs that earlier Cahokians had considered unworthy of consumption. Turtles, frogs, and snakes from wetland environments. Freshwater mussels in quantities suggesting they were a staple rather than a supplement. And even dogs, which had previously been kept as pets or hunting companions rather than food sources. Plant remains show similar desperation, increased consumption of weedy plants like goosefoot and marsh elder that were high-effort, low-reward foods compared to corn, beans, and squash. Evidence of harvesting immature corn before it fully ripened, sacrificing future yields for immediate needs, and collection of wild plant foods from increasingly distant locations as nearby areas were exhausted. Household assemblages show people making tools from increasingly low-quality materials as preferred lithic sources became unavailable or too expensive. And most tellingly, storage pits become smaller and less common in residential areas, suggesting that people no longer had surplus to store and were living hand-to-mouth, consuming food as soon as they acquired it, because they had no confidence there would be more tomorrow. The environmental catastrophe that destroyed Cahokia was not inevitable. It resulted from specific choices about resource use and population size that could have been made differently. Other Mississippian societies facing similar challenges survived by limiting population growth, diversifying their resource base, maintaining forest reserves for long-term use, and developing more sustainable agricultural practices that preserved soil fertility. Cahokia's leaders chose a different path, pursuing maximum short-term growth and power at the expense of long-term sustainability. And when environmental conditions changed in ways that punished that choice, they lacked the flexibility to adapt. The monuments they built became tombstones, marking not just a dead civilization, but a failed strategy of resource exploitation, a warning etched in earth and bone that unlimited growth in a finite environment is not just unsustainable, but ultimately catastrophic, destroying not only the resources that growth depends on, but the entire civilization that pursued growth as its primary goal. The environmental catastrophe documented in pollen cores and skeletal remains did not destroy Cahokia directly. Forests do not fight wars, droughts do not tear down cities, and hunger by itself does not make monuments crumble. What environmental collapse did was destroy the social consensus that held Cahokian civilization together, undermining every relationship of trust and reciprocity that made urban life possible and transforming a complex society into a collection of desperate individuals concerned only with immediate survival. The transition from environmental crisis to social collapse happened gradually but inexorably over the course of several decades in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, as one after another of the institutions that had organized Cahokian life failed to deliver on their promises. The elite who claimed supernatural power could not make the rains return or the forests regrow. The trade networks that had brought exotic goods from across the continent dried up as drought affected all regions simultaneously. The religious ceremonies that promised cosmic order and earthly prosperity rang hollow as conditions grew worse despite increasingly elaborate rituals, and the walls that were supposed to protect the city instead divided it, creating visible evidence that the ruling class valued their own survival above that of the common people they claimed to serve and protect. The first signs of social breakdown appeared in the outer residential zones, the neighborhoods farthest from the ceremonial center, where commoners lived in small houses with minimal access to elite-controlled resources. Archaeological survey of these areas reveals a pattern of gradual abandonment beginning around 1175 AD and accelerating through the early 13th century. Houses that had been carefully maintained for generations suddenly show signs of neglect: roofs left unrepaired, walls collapsing, storage pits unused. Artifact assemblages in abandoned houses often include items that would normally have been taken when families moved: ceramic vessels, stone tools, bone needles, and awls. The presence of these objects suggests people left suddenly, perhaps fleeing in the night to avoid being stopped by authorities who wanted to prevent emigration. Or perhaps they left openly but were in such desperate circumstances that they could not afford the time and energy to pack belongings, choosing instead to travel light and fast to wherever they hoped conditions might be better. In either case, the message is clear. By the late 12th century, significant numbers of Cahokians had concluded that their chances of survival were better somewhere else, anywhere else, than in the dying city where they had been born. As population declined in the outer zones, the social fabric that had held neighborhoods together began to fray in ways that made conditions even worse for those who remained. Urban life requires cooperation, shared labor for maintaining infrastructure, mutual aid during emergencies, social pressure to maintain norms of behavior. When population drops below critical thresholds, these cooperative systems break down. Streets go unrepaired because there are too few people to organize work crews. Drainage ditches fill with sediment because no one has the energy or motivation to clean them out. Trash accumulates because the social pressure to dispose of waste properly disappears when neighborhoods are half empty. Violence increases because potential perpetrators realize there are fewer witnesses and less likelihood of collective punishment. The archaeological signature shows exactly this kind of deterioration. Trash heaps growing in areas that had previously been kept clean, drainage systems clogging and causing localized flooding, and a spike in unburied or poorly buried bodies, suggesting that normal funerary practices were breaking down as families lacked the resources or social connections to provide proper burials for their dead. These are not the traces of a functioning society, but of one in the late stages of collapse, where basic social institutions no longer work, and people are focused purely on individual survival. The middle zones of the city areas occupied by craft specialists, successful merchants, and minor religious officials held together longer than the outer residential areas, but ultimately suffered the same fate. These households had more resources than commoners and stronger connections to the elite, giving them greater resilience in the face of crisis. But as trade networks collapsed and elite patronage dried up, even successful craft specialists found their livelihoods disappearing. A copper worker could produce beautiful ornaments, but if there was no copper arriving from the Great Lakes and no elite customers who could afford to purchase prestige goods, his skills became worthless. A potter might produce superior ceramics, but if people were struggling to find food, they had no surplus to exchange for fancy vessels. Gradually, the specialized producers who had been the backbone of Cahokia's economy either emigrated to other centers where their skills were still valued, or were forced to abandon their crafts and return to subsistence agriculture, joining the desperate scramble for survival that was consuming the entire society. The archaeological evidence shows workshop areas that had been continuously occupied for generations suddenly going silent, with tools left in place and partially finished products abandoned mid-production, as though the craftspeople simply walked away one day and never returned. The religious crisis that paralleled the economic and environmental collapse was perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Cahokia's decline. Remember that Cahokian ideology rested fundamentally on claims about supernatural power, that rulers had special relationships with divine forces, that ceremonies could influence natural events, that the city itself was sacred space, blessed by the gods, and destined for eternal prosperity. Every major decision, every resource allocation, every sacrifice had been justified by reference to these religious claims. But as conditions deteriorated despite increasingly elaborate ceremonies, as the droughts continued despite sacrifices, as hunger stalked the city despite prayers and rituals, people would have naturally begun questioning whether the whole religious edifice was a lie. Perhaps the rulers had no special power. Perhaps the gods, if they existed at all, had abandoned Cahokia. Perhaps the entire ideological system was just a mechanism for elite exploitation, a way of extracting labor and resources from commoners under false pretenses. We cannot know exactly when the tipping point came, when enough Cahokians lost faith to make the system unsustainable, but we can see its effects in the archaeological record, ceremonies becoming less elaborate as resources dwindled and participation declined, temples being abandoned before the surrounding residential areas, suggesting priests were among the first to leave, and religious artifacts appearing in trash heaps rather than being carefully curated, indicating that sacred objects had lost their power to command respect once people stopped believing in the forces they represented. The ruling elite faced an impossible dilemma as their power base eroded beneath them. They could acknowledge failure, admit that their claims of supernatural authority were false or ineffective, and voluntarily relinquish power, but this would likely result in their own deaths as angry mobs sought revenge for decades or centuries of exploitation. Or they could double down, insisting that the crisis was temporary, that the rituals would eventually work, that loyalty would be rewarded and disloyalty punished, but this strategy required resources they no longer controlled and credibility they no longer possessed. The archaeological evidence suggests they chose the latter course, becoming increasingly authoritarian and coercive as their ideological legitimacy collapsed. The walls grew higher and thicker, transforming from defensive structures into instruments of social control. Violence-related injuries increased dramatically in skeletal remains from elite contexts during this period, suggesting that ruling families were fighting among themselves as different factions proposed different survival strategies and competed for control of dwindling resources. Human sacrifice may have actually increased in frequency and elaboration, as desperate leaders staged ever more spectacular ceremonies, trying to convince themselves and their followers that the old rituals still worked, that the gods were listening, that prosperity would return if only the proper offerings were made with sufficient devotion. But all the walls and sacrifices and desperate ceremonies could not change the fundamental reality that Cahokia had grown too large for its resource base, and that environmental degradation plus climatic drought had made the situation unrecoverable within the existing political and economic system. By 1250 AD, the city that had once housed 50,000 people probably contained fewer than 20,000, and the decline was accelerating. The Grand Plaza, which had hosted markets and ceremonies attended by thousands, now saw only sparse gatherings of the faithful or the fearful, the empty space emphasizing how much had been lost. The great boulevards designed to handle crowds now lay mostly empty, grass and weeds growing up through the packed earth surfaces that had once been maintained so carefully. The grid of residential streets that had seemed to demonstrate Cahokian sophistication now looked like a ghost town, with empty houses outnumbering occupied ones in many neighborhoods. And most ominously, fires were becoming more common as abandoned wooden structures ignited accidentally or were deliberately burned, whether by departing residents destroying what they could not take or by desperate survivors scavenging for scarce fuel wood. The social violence that had been building throughout the crisis period began manifesting in new and disturbing ways as desperation reached its peak. Skeletal evidence shows not just increased frequency of violence-related injuries, but changes in the patterns of violence that suggest social breakdown rather than organized warfare. Earlier periods show violence primarily in adult males, consistent with warfare or raiding between communities. But the late period shows violence distributed across all age and sex categories, men, women, even children, bearing marks of blunt force trauma, blade cuts, and other injuries that suggest indiscriminate brutality rather than rule-bound combat. Some skeletal remains show evidence of peri-mortem trauma injuries inflicted at or near the time of death, combined with evidence of defleshing and disarticulation, raising the horrifying possibility that cannibalism may have occurred during the final desperate years of Cahokia's occupation. This would not be unique. Other collapsing civilizations have resorted to cannibalism when starvation became severe enough, but it would represent the ultimate breakdown of social norms, the point at which people abandoned the cultural taboos that distinguished them from animals and embraced pure survival instinct regardless of moral cost. The process of abandonment was neither sudden nor uniform, but unfolded unevenly over nearly a century, with different neighborhoods and different social classes leaving at different times and for different reasons. The outer residential zones emptied first, as commoners with the least to lose and the least attachment to the existing system simply walked away when conditions became intolerable. the craft production zones and middle-status residential areas held on longer as people with specialized skills and some accumulated wealth hoped conditions would improve and their investments would not be entirely wasted. The elite districts around Monk's Mound lasted longest of all, as ruling families clung to power and privilege even as the society that sustained them disintegrated. But eventually, even the elite had to face reality. A king without subjects is not a king, but merely a desperate individual squatting in a ruined temple atop an earthen pyramid. And at some point, the remaining elite families made the rational decision to cut their losses and flee to other centers where they might preserve some measure of their status and wealth. The exact moment when the last priest abandoned the last temple atop Monk's Mound is lost to history, but it probably occurred sometime between 1300 and 1350 AD, ending 3 centuries of continuous occupation and leaving behind only silent monuments to mark where one of the world's great cities had once thrived. The demographic patterns visible in the archaeological record document the slow hemorrhaging of population that characterized Cahokia's collapse. Population estimates derived from site survey, household counts, and burial analysis show a city of approximately 50,000 people around 1100 AD at the peak. By 1200, population had declined to perhaps 35,000, a significant drop, but still a substantial urban center. By 1250, only 20,000 remained, and the rate of decline was accelerating. By 1300, perhaps 5,000 people still lived in the central districts, clustered around the main mounds and maintaining some semblance of urban life. By 1350, the city was essentially abandoned, with at most a few hundred people living in scattered households among the ruins, no longer maintaining the mounds, no longer performing the great ceremonies, no longer participating in the specialized economy that had made Cahokia unique. Within just 250 years, the greatest city in pre-Columbian North America had been reduced to an empty landscape of grass-covered earthworks, visible to anyone passing through, but comprehensible to no one, because the knowledge of who built them and why had already begun fading from memory, as survivors scattered to the winds and integrated into other communities where they learned to forget the city that had failed them so catastrophically. Where did all those people go when they left Cahokia? Modern archaeological and genetic evidence provides partial answers. Some moved north to join or found new communities in the upper Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes region, carrying Mississippian cultural traditions into areas where they mixed with local populations to create hybrid cultures. Some moved south down the Mississippi toward the Gulf Coast, establishing new towns that maintained some Cahokian traditions while adapting to different environmental conditions. Some moved west onto the Great Plains, where archaeological sites show sudden appearance of Mississippian-style pottery and architecture in regions that had previously lacked such features. And some moved east into the Ohio Valley and beyond, reconnecting with distant relatives or establishing themselves as strangers in communities that had never directly participated in Cahokian networks. But wherever they went, they apparently chose not to recreate Cahokia in miniature, not to build new mound centers that might rise to replace the failed capital. Perhaps they had learned that monumentality and concentrated power were paths to disaster. Perhaps they concluded that smaller, more dispersed communities were more sustainable and less vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic collapse that had destroyed their former home. Or perhaps they simply lacked the numbers and resources to attempt such projects, forced into survival mode where building monuments seemed like lunacy when the immediate challenge was finding enough food to live another day. The silence that descended over Cahokia after its abandonment was not merely an absence of human activity, but an erasure of memory so complete that within a few generations, even neighboring communities seemed to have forgotten what the mounds represented. When French explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, nearly 300 years after Cahokia's final abandonment, they asked local Native American tribes about the massive earthworks. The responses they received were vague and uncertain. They were here when we arrived. Our ancestors did not build them. We do not know who made them or why they left. Either the knowledge had been genuinely lost as survivors of the collapse integrated into other communities, and their distinctive cultural identity dissolved over time, or it was being deliberately concealed, perhaps because the memory of Cahokia had become a source of shame or trauma that people preferred not to discuss. In either case, the effect was the same. By the time Europeans arrived with the intention of documenting and understanding these remarkable structures, the information that would have made understanding possible had vanished as completely as the city itself, transforming Cahokia from history into mystery, from a documented past into a puzzle that archaeologists would spend centuries trying to solve, with nothing but material remains and fragments of oral traditions that might or might not be reliable guides to what had actually happened in the American bottom nearly a millennium ago. The erasure of memory that would eventually make Cahokia a mystery to European colonizers did not happen all at once, but began during the city's final occupied decades, as the last residents made deliberate choices about what to preserve and what to abandon. When archaeologists excavate the uppermost occupation layers at Cahokia, the final phases before complete abandonment, they find a pattern that is both puzzling and poignant. Valuable objects left behind, sacred spaces abandoned without apparent ritual closure, and domestic areas that show signs of sudden departure rather than planned, orderly evacuation. This is not what we would expect if Cahokia had been conquered by enemies who would have looted the city, destroying monuments and desecrating temples to demonstrate their victory. Nor is it consistent with gradual decline, where the last residents would have carefully packed their most valuable possessions before leaving. Instead, the archaeological signature suggests something more complex, a population that had lost faith not just in their leaders, but in the entire cultural system those leaders represented, choosing to walk away from everything associated with the failed civilization, rather than trying to preserve traditions that had brought them only suffering and death. The physical evidence of Cahokia's final decades paints a picture of accelerating disintegration, as the few remaining residents struggled to maintain even basic urban functions. The massive defensive walls that had been rebuilt multiple times during the crisis period now stood in disrepair, with sections collapsed and not reconstructed, suggesting that whoever was responsible for maintenance either lacked the resources or no longer saw the point in preserving barriers that had failed to protect the city from its real enemies: hunger, drought, and social collapse. The Grand Plaza, which had once been carefully resurfaced periodically to maintain a smooth surface for ceremonies and gatherings, now shows evidence of neglect in its final phases. Erosion gullies cutting across the once pristine surface, trash accumulating in areas that would previously have been kept meticulously clean, and even evidence of small structures being built within the plaza itself, indicating that sacred space was being repurposed for profane uses as religious authority collapsed. The great boulevards that had organized Cahokian urban space were being encroached upon by residential structures, as the grid system that had once seemed inviolable broke down and people built wherever they found convenient, no longer constrained by urban planning regulations that nobody had the authority or will to enforce. The temples and elite residences atop the major mounds provide the most striking evidence of how completely the Cahokian system had failed by the early 14th century. Earlier occupation phases show these structures being regularly rebuilt and refurbished, maintaining the impressive appearance that symbolized elite power and divine favor. But the final phases show rapid deterioration, roofs collapsing and not repaired, walls leaning at dangerous angles, floors littered with debris that would previously have been swept away. Some structures show evidence of deliberate dismantling, with valuable wooden beams and posts removed, probably by departing residents who needed building materials for new homes wherever they were relocating. Other structures appear to have simply burned, whether accidentally or deliberately, with charred remains left in place rather than being cleared away. Most significantly, the artifact assemblages from these final elite occupation layers are remarkably impoverished, lacking the exotic trade goods and elaborate prestige items that characterized earlier elite deposits, and suggesting that by the end, Even the ruling families had lost access to the wealth and connections that had once defined their status. They were ruling over ruins, presiding over ceremonies that nobody attended, maintaining traditions that nobody believed in anymore, clinging to power that had become purely nominal because they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do. The chronology of Cahokia's final abandonment can be traced with reasonable precision through ceramic seriation, radiocarbon dating, and stratigraphic analysis of occupation layers. Around 1200 AD, the outer residential zones were already largely abandoned, with only scattered households remaining in areas that had once been densely populated. By 1250 AD, even the intermediate zones were mostly empty, and population had concentrated in the central districts immediately surrounding Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza. By 1300 AD, occupation had contracted further, with people living only on or immediately adjacent to the major mounds, as though clustering around these symbols of past glory could somehow reverse the collapse that was consuming them. And then, sometime between 1300 and 1350 AD, even these last holdouts departed, leaving behind a landscape of abandoned monuments that would slowly be reclaimed by the natural vegetation that humans had temporarily displaced. The exact sequence of departure is impossible to reconstruct in detail. We cannot know whether people left in organized groups or as individual families, whether departures were scheduled and planned or spontaneous and chaotic, but the overall pattern is clear. This was not a single dramatic moment of abandonment, but a drawn-out process spanning several generations, during which Cahokia slowly bled population until finally there was nobody left to turn out the lights. What is most remarkable about Cahokia's abandonment is what did not happen. There is no evidence of a final catastrophic event that forced evacuation. The archaeological record shows no signs of invasion and conquest, no layers of burned structures throughout the site, no mass graves filled with warriors killed in battle, no caches of enemy weapons or evidence of fortifications being overwhelmed. There is no evidence of epidemic disease that might have killed the population too quickly to allow burial skeletal assemblages from the final phases show increased mortality from malnutrition and endemic diseases, but nothing suggesting the sudden, catastrophic die-off that would characterize plague or epidemic. There are no signs of natural disaster, no earthquake damage, no flood deposits that might indicate the city was inundated, no volcanic ash layers or other evidence of environmental catastrophe. Instead, the city was simply abandoned by people who concluded, individually or collectively, that their chances of survival were better elsewhere, that the benefits of urban life no longer outweighed the costs, and that Cahokia had nothing left to offer them except hunger, violence, and the empty promises of leaders who had proven their incompetence through repeated failure. This kind of abandonment through loss of confidence may be the harshest judgment history can render on a civilization not dramatic enough to be remembered in epic tales, but final and complete nonetheless. The question of where Cahokia's population went when they left has fascinated archaeologists and historians for decades, because the answer might tell us whether people maintained any sense of Cahokian identity after the collapse, or whether they deliberately sought to erase that identity and start fresh in new communities. Archaeological and linguistic evidence provides partial answers, but raises as many questions as it resolves. Throughout the Mississippi Valley and surrounding regions, sites dating to the late 13th and 14th centuries show evidence of population influx, new settlements being founded, existing villages growing larger, ceramic traditions showing sudden appearance of Cahokian-style designs mixed with local traditions. This suggests that Cahokian refugees were dispersing widely and integrating into existing communities rather than maintaining separate enclaves where they could preserve their distinctive culture. Oral traditions from various Native American tribes contain vague references to ancestral migrations from a great city in the south or east, but these traditions are ambiguous and difficult to link definitively to Cahokia. Genetic studies show that many modern Native American populations in the Midwest and Great Plains carry genetic markers consistent with ancestry from Mississippian populations, but genetic evidence cannot distinguish between Cahokian refugees and other Mississippian groups who might have migrated for different reasons. What seems clear is that Cahokian refugees made a deliberate choice not to recreate their former city elsewhere, not to build new mound centers that might rise to replace the failed capital, not to maintain the political and religious institutions that had characterized Cahokian society. This was not because they lacked the technical knowledge. The engineering and organizational skills needed to build mounds did not disappear simply because Cahokia failed. Rather, it suggests that people had learned a painful lesson about the dangers of concentrated power, monumental construction, and unsustainable resource extraction. The refugees apparently concluded that smaller, more dispersed communities were safer and more sustainable than the kind of urban concentration that Cahokia had represented. They chose to live in villages rather than cities, to practice extensive rather than intensive agriculture, to maintain forests rather than clear-cutting them for construction materials. Whether this was a conscious, articulated decision based on analysis of what had gone wrong at Cahokia, or simply an instinctive recoil from anything associated with trauma and failure, the effect was the same. Within a few generations of Cahokia's collapse, the entire Mississippian tradition of mound building and urban concentration began declining throughout the eastern United States, as though the failure of the greatest Mississippian center had discredited the entire cultural pattern it represented. The speed with which knowledge about Cahokia was lost or suppressed remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the city's history. By the time European explorers and colonists arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, only 200 to 300 years after Cahokia's final abandonment, local Native American populations seemed to have little specific knowledge about who built the mounds, when they were built, or why they were abandoned. The French priest Jacques Marquette, exploring the Mississippi in 1673, noted the presence of large earthworks, but reported that local tribes attributed them to ancient peoples who had lived long before. Later visitors received similar responses. The mounds were ancient, their builders unknown, their purpose mysterious. This loss of historical memory within just a few centuries is remarkable and suggests either that the cultural disruption caused by Cahokia's collapse was so severe that knowledge could not be transmitted across generations, or that survivors deliberately chose not to pass on information about a traumatic past they wanted to forget, or that European diseases and colonization disrupted Native American societies so severely in the 16th and 17th centuries that oral traditions were lost in the chaos. The archaeological challenge of interpreting Cahokia's final phases is complicated by the fact that the uppermost occupation layers the evidence of the city's last years have been severely damaged or destroyed by later activities. Unlike deeply buried early layers that are protected by later deposits, the final occupation layers lie near or at the modern ground surface, making them vulnerable to plowing, erosion, looting, and construction. Many of the most important questions about Cahokia's end could potentially be answered if we had intact deposits from the period 1300 to 1350 AD, but these deposits have been largely obliterated by 300 years of farming and development in the American bottom. What little remains suggests a population living in increasingly marginal conditions, occupying only small portions of what had once been a vast urban landscape, maintaining only fragments of the elaborate material culture that had characterized Cahokia at its height. The ceramics from this period are simpler and cruder than earlier phases, lacking the elaborate decorations that required specialized skill and abundant leisure time. The houses are smaller and more poorly constructed, as though people no longer had the resources or motivation to build properly. And the general impression from the archaeological evidence is one of a society that had simply given up, going through the motions of survival without any hope that conditions would improve or any vision of a better future to work toward. The final ceremonies performed at Cahokia before its complete abandonment must have been profoundly melancholy occasions, if they occurred at all. We can imagine a small group of elderly priests, the last guardians of traditions that nobody else remembered or cared about, performing rituals atop Monk's Mound for an audience of perhaps a few dozen people, the vast plaza stretching empty before them as a visible reminder of everything that had been lost. Did they still believe in the efficacy of their ceremonies, Or were they simply going through motions because it was the only thing they knew how to do? Did they promise that the gods would return, that prosperity would be restored, that Cahokia would rise again? Or had even they lost faith, performing rituals mechanically because tradition demanded it, even though nobody expected results? And when the last priest finally descended from the last temple for the final time and walked away from Cahokia forever, did he look back at the monuments his ancestors had built? Or did he keep his eyes fixed ahead on whatever uncertain future awaited him in some distant community that might not want him and might not need the specialized religious knowledge that had defined his identity? These questions cannot be answered from archaeological evidence, but they haunt anyone who stands among Cahokia's ruins and contemplates the end of a civilization. By 1400 AD, Cahokia was completely abandoned. Its monuments silent, its plazas empty, its houses collapsed or burned, its streets overgrown with grass and weeds. The forest that had been so thoroughly cleared during the city's occupation began slowly reclaiming the landscape, with pioneer species like willows and cottonwoods colonizing abandoned fields and residential areas, gradually shading out the grasses and herbs that had temporarily dominated the disturbed ground. Young trees began growing on the mounds themselves, their roots gradually working into the earthen structures, beginning a slow process of natural degradation that would continue for centuries. Wildlife returned to the American bottom, with deer and elk recolonizing areas where they had been hunted to near extinction during Cahokia's peak population. The rivers ran clearer as erosion from deforested hillsides gradually declined and vegetation stabilized the soils. And the silence that descended over the former Metropolis was broken only by natural sounds, wind in the grass, rain on earth, the calls of returning birds, a peace that must have seemed almost supernatural after centuries of urban noise and activity. Nature was erasing the evidence of human occupation, slowly but inexorably reclaiming a landscape that had briefly been transformed by human ambition, but that had ultimately proven too powerful to be permanently controlled. A landscape that would still be there, essentially unchanged, long after every trace of Cahokian civilization had returned to the soil from which it came. The silence that settled over Cahokia after its final abandonment, around 1350-1400 AD, lasted for more than 4 centuries, during which the earthen pyramids stood as mute witnesses to a civilization that had vanished so completely that even its name was lost. When European colonizers first arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, they found the mounds but had no context for understanding them, no framework for believing that Native Americans could have built monuments on such a scale. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Here were structures that rivaled anything in Europe, built with sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge, yet the local Native American populations lived in small villages and seemed to have no connection to the ancient monuments. Rather than accept the obvious conclusion that Native American civilizations had once been far more complex than colonizers wanted to acknowledge, early American settlers invented elaborate mythologies to explain the mounds. They attributed them to lost tribes of Israel, to Phoenician sailors, to Welsh princes, to any group other than the indigenous peoples whose land they were actively stealing. This willful blindness delayed serious archaeological investigation of Cahokia for nearly 2 centuries and contributed to the destruction of countless irreplaceable sites as farmers plowed through mounds and developers built roads and towns over ancient plazas, treating irreplaceable archaeological resources as inconvenient obstacles to progress rather than as windows into humanity's past. The systematic archaeological investigation of Cahokia began surprisingly late, not until the early 20th century, and by that time enormous damage had already been done. The French monks who farmed Monk's Mound in the early 1800s had no idea they were destroying archaeological deposits. They simply saw a convenient elevated plot of land protected from flooding. The railroad that was built through the Cahokia site in the 1800s cut through multiple mounds, obliterating them completely. The town of Cahokia, Illinois, grew up directly over portions of the ancient city, with houses, streets, and businesses built on top of unexcavated archaeological deposits. Farmers plowing fields for 2 centuries had been turning up artifacts, stone tools, pottery sherds, human bones, and simply tossing them aside as nuisances. By the time professional archaeologists arrived with scientific methods and research questions, approximately 90% of the original site had been destroyed or severely compromised, leaving only fragments of what had once been North America's greatest pre-Columbian city. This represents one of the greatest archaeological tragedies in American history, comparable to the destruction of ancient sites in the Middle East and Mediterranean by early treasure hunters and looters who cared nothing for the historical knowledge they were destroying in their search for valuable artifacts. The first systematic excavations at Cahokia in the 1920s and 1930s began revealing the true scale and sophistication of what had been lost, though it would take decades before the full picture emerged. Early archaeologists, working with limited budgets and primitive techniques by modern standards, nonetheless managed to document the basic structure of the site: the arrangement of mounds, the existence of the Grand Plaza, the presence of specialized craft production areas. But many of their interpretations were constrained by the prejudices of their era, which assumed that Native Americans were inherently incapable of complex civilization. Even when evidence clearly pointed to sophisticated urban planning and astronomical knowledge, some scholars resisted the implications, preferring to attribute Cahokia to hypothetical influences from Mexico or even transoceanic contact, rather than accepting that indigenous North American societies had developed complex civilization independently. It was not until the 1960s and 1970s, as archaeological methods improved and as the civil rights movement forced white Americans to confront their assumptions about race and capability, that mainstream archaeology finally acknowledged what should have been obvious from the beginning. Cahokia was a genuine urban civilization built by the ancestors of modern Native Americans, representing one of humanity's great achievements in urban planning, engineering, and social organization. The excavation of Mound 72 in 1967 marked a turning point in Cahokia studies, because the mass burials found there forced archaeologists to grapple with uncomfortable realities about Cahokian society. This was not the peaceful, egalitarian community that some romanticized accounts had imagined, but a complex, stratified civilization with powerful rulers who commanded life and death, who could mobilize enormous labor forces for monument construction, and who practiced human sacrifice on a scale unprecedented in North America. The discovery generated controversy that continues today. Some scholars emphasize the oppressive nature of Cahokian society and see the collapse as a kind of liberation for subject populations. Others argue that we should not judge ancient societies by modern ethical standards, and that human sacrifice was a legitimate religious practice within its cultural context. Still others suggest that focusing on the violence obscures the genuine achievements in astronomy, engineering, and urban planning that Cahokia represents. These debates remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable because they touch on fundamental questions about how we evaluate past civilizations and whether technological sophistication can be separated from the human costs required to achieve it. What's clear is that Mound 72 transformed our understanding of Cahokia from a simple narrative of impressive monuments to a more complex and troubling picture of a civilization that combined extraordinary achievements with extraordinary brutality. Modern archaeological techniques have revolutionized our ability to study Cahokia without destructive excavation, using technologies that did not exist when early investigators were literally digging through the site. Ground-penetrating radar can detect buried structures and features without digging, revealing house patterns, storage pits, and even the locations of former walls and fences. Magnetometry measures subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by human activities, allowing archaeologists to map entire residential neighborhoods and craft production areas from magnetic signatures alone. LiDAR light detection and ranging uses laser pulses fired from aircraft to create incredibly detailed topographic maps that reveal subtle earthworks invisible to observers on the ground, showing that the landscape around the major mounds is full of smaller features that had gone unnoticed for centuries. Isotope analysis of human bones can determine where individuals were born and raised based on the chemical signatures of the water and food they consumed during childhood, revealing that Cahokia's population came from across the continent. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains is beginning to trace genetic relationships between Cahokian populations and modern Native American tribes, potentially resolving questions about who the Cahokians were and where their descendants live today. These techniques are generating more data than can be easily analyzed, and each new finding seems to raise more questions than it answers. The designation of Cahokia Mounds as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982 represented official international recognition of the site's significance and provided some protection against further destruction. But this designation came too late to save the 90% of the site already destroyed, too late to prevent the construction of Interstate 55 through portions of the ancient city, too late to preserve countless mounds that had been leveled by farmers and developers. What remains today is a fragment, impressive in its own right, but merely a shadow of what once existed. Standing in the parking lot of the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site, visitors see approximately 80 surviving mounds out of the original 120 scattered across a landscape that is a patchwork of preserved archaeological zones, modern housing developments, farmland, and highways. It requires considerable imagination to visualize what the city looked like at its height, with 50,000 people living in carefully planned neighborhoods, smoke rising from 10,000 cooking fires, crowds processing along boulevards toward the Grand Plaza, traders arriving by canoe with exotic goods from across the continent. The monuments that survive are impressive. Monk's Mound remains the largest pre-Columbian earthwork north of Mexico, but they are also monuments to what we have lost, reminders of how much archaeological knowledge has been irretrievably destroyed by centuries of neglect and active destruction. The greatest mysteries about Cahokia remain frustratingly unresolved despite decades of intensive investigation. We still do not know what language the Cahokians spoke, though linguistic analysis of modern Native American languages suggests possible connections to Siouan or Algonquian language families. We do not know what they called themselves, or their city Cahokia is simply the name of a later Native American group that lived in the area centuries after the ancient city was abandoned and has no connection to the original inhabitants. We do not know the names of any individual leaders, the specific details of their religious beliefs, or how their political system actually functioned on a day-to-day basis. We do not know why they built exactly 120 mounds rather than some other number, or what symbolic or practical significance that specific count held. We do not know whether the collapse was primarily driven by environmental factors, political failures, religious crisis, or some combination that we have not yet fully understood. And most frustratingly, we do not know where the detailed knowledge about all these questions went, whether it was genuinely lost as survivors integrated into other communities and cultural transmission failed, or whether it still exists somewhere in oral traditions that have not been shared with or recognized by academic researchers. The relationship between professional archaeologists and Native American communities has evolved considerably since the early days of Cahokia research, though tensions remain. Early archaeologists treated Native American sites as scientific resources to be studied without regard for the wishes of descendant communities, excavating burials and removing artifacts to museums where they could be displayed or stored indefinitely. The passage of NAGPRA in 1990 fundamentally changed this relationship, requiring consultation with tribes and repatriation of human remains and sacred objects when requested. For Cahokia, this has meant difficult conversations about whether skeletal remains should be returned for reburial, even though doing so would prevent future scientific analysis using techniques that have not yet been invented. Many Native American groups argue that their ancestors deserve rest and that scientific curiosity does not justify keeping human remains in museum storage indefinitely. Many archaeologists counter that the remains represent irreplaceable sources of information about human history and that reburial would destroy our ability to answer questions about Cahokian society, questions that might benefit everyone, including descendant communities. These are not easy issues with clear right answers, and the ongoing negotiations between researchers and tribes represent an attempt to balance competing values of scientific knowledge, cultural respect, and human dignity. The lessons that modern civilization might learn from Cahokia's collapse are obvious, yet somehow always ignored. Cahokia demonstrates that environmental degradation can destroy even the most impressive civilizations, that short-term success does not guarantee long-term viability, and that societies can grow beyond their sustainable carrying capacity and collapse as a result. Yet modern industrial civilization continues pursuing unlimited growth on a finite planet, stripping resources faster than they can regenerate, altering climate systems in ways we barely understand, and assuming that technology will somehow solve problems that are fundamentally economic and political rather than technical. Cahokia shows that concentrated power and extreme inequality make societies brittle and vulnerable, that ruling elites often prioritize their own short-term interests over long-term sustainability, and that when crisis comes, barriers built to protect the powerful instead become tombstones marking their failure. Yet modern societies continue concentrating wealth and power, building walls both literal and metaphorical to separate elites from the masses, assuming that somehow our situation is different and that the patterns that destroyed past civilizations will not apply to us. Cahokia demonstrates that civilizational collapse is not a dramatic Hollywood moment, but a gradual unraveling as institutions fail one by one, as faith in leaders and systems erodes, as people quietly give up and walk away from commitments that no longer serve them. Yet we continue assuming that our institutions are permanent, that our systems are stable, that collapse is something that happens to other people in other times but could never happen to us. Perhaps the most profound lesson from Cahokia is the most uncomfortable. Success and failure are not opposites, but points on a continuum, and the very factors that drive success can become causes of failure when circumstances change. Cahokia succeeded spectacularly by concentrating population, specializing economic production, building monumental architecture, and exploiting its strategic location to dominate continental trade networks. But population concentration made the city vulnerable to resource depletion. Economic specialization made it fragile when trade networks collapsed. Monumental architecture consumed resources that could have been invested in sustainability. And exploiting strategic location worked only as long as the transportation networks remained viable. There was no villain in this story, no evil leader who deliberately destroyed the civilization, no external enemy who conquered and burned the city. Cahokia failed because its successes were unsustainable, and because when conditions changed, the very structures that had made it great became obstacles to adaptation. This is a pattern that recurs throughout human history, from ancient Rome to modern industrial economies, and recognizing it does not seem to help us avoid repeating it, because the short-term benefits of unsustainable strategies are so compelling and the long-term costs are so easy to ignore or externalize onto future generations who have no voice in present decisions. Today, Cahokia Mounds sits quietly on the edge of metropolitan St. Louis, visited by perhaps 100,000 people, annually a respectable number for an archaeological site, but a tiny fraction of the population that lives within an hour's drive and has no idea the site exists. Most Americans have never heard of Cahokia, despite it being the largest archaeological site in the United States and one of the most significant in the world. It does not appear in most history textbooks, does not feature in popular culture, does not capture public imagination the way Egyptian pyramids or Mayan temples do. This obscurity is itself a kind of erasure, a continuation of the process that began when the city was abandoned and its memory was allowed to fade. But perhaps this obscurity also represents an opportunity. Cahokia can teach us things that more famous ancient sites cannot, precisely because it failed so completely, because it rose and fell within a relatively short time span, and because the archaeological record documents that entire cycle in ways that allow us to understand the mechanisms of both success and collapse. The silent mounds rising from the floodplain are not just monuments to a vanished civilization, but mirrors reflecting our own society back at us, asking uncomfortable questions about sustainability, about inequality, about the price of progress and whether we are willing to pay it, about whether the future we are building will endure, or whether future archaeologists will someday puzzle over our ruins the way we puzzle over Cahokia, wondering how something that seemed so successful could fail so completely, and whether anyone learned anything from our mistakes before repeating them yet again.